You wake before the sun admits the river exists. The room keeps its own weather. Thin ice rims the water pail, your breath lifts in pale threads, the iron stove sits still and innocent, as if it has never known fire. Boards murmur as you slide your feet to the braided rug, which is only slightly less cold than the floor that required it. Frost ferns the window, each vein a patient line. You listen to the hush of the St. Lawrence, a sound like cloth being folded, and you let the day fold itself without your assistance. You sit because mornings do not ask for speed. Your hands find sleeves warming on the chair back, wool that remembers last night's heat longer than you do. The cap that learned the shape of your brow settles into place by instinct. The straw tick sighs when you stand, which feels like agreement. You roll your shoulders and accept the day without ceremony. Waking is a chore among chores, and you prefer chores that do not pretend to be important. The room rewards your restraint by remaining exactly itself, which is all you ask of a room. The air tastes faintly of last night's tallow and of pine smoke that forgot to leave. It is an honest smell, the sort that refuses to apologize for usefulness. On the pewter saucer, a few drops have cooled into a ridged crown. You prise it up with a thumbnail and set it aside with other scraps for evening melt. The room keeps itself simple. Table, stool, shelf of molds and rods, a coil of cotton wicks sleeping like a pale rope, and the crate that will carry today's light to other people's rooms. Every object remembers its task and expects you to remember yours. You cross to the window for your first measure of morning. Chimney smoke lies low, reluctant to climb. Down near the wharf, a bell taps once against a post, admitting that someone is already awake and trying to be reasonable about it. A rooster rehearses and gives up. Snow along the lane holds the shape of last night's wind, as if it were pleased by the attention. You hold your palm near the glass and feel the cold studying your lines. It discovers nothing new and moves on, which seems fair. On the table, you lay out the tools that conduct your small government. A knife that found its edge on the whetstone, a blunt awl with a handle smooth to your thumb, a beeswax slab wrapped in linen, tallow cakes, promising usefulness rather than beauty. You touch each thing because touching is a form of thinking. The pewter molds rest like metal loaves cooling. The dipping rods wait on the rack by the door, where the draft will later behave like an assistant instead of a nuisance. The room takes attendance and waits. You open the tinderbox without hurry. Flint speaks to steel. Char accepts the compliment, and a coal grows from brown to bright. You feed it to a twist of tow, and then to a candle stub saved for mornings exactly like this. Light arrives with unshowy authority. The walls step forward from the dark and remember their boards. Shadows report for duty. The stove continues pretending innocence, which you indulge for a few breaths. There is dignity in letting warmth ask politely before you supply it. You enjoy being asked nicely by inanimate things. Your fingers warm themselves by motion. You trim the stub's wick, set a clean saucer, align the dipping rods, and straighten the pale coil of cotton until it recalls the habit of a line. Small sounds climb into the rafters and disappear. The pewters click, the creak of the table, the soft scuff of your heel on the rug. You look at your hands and decide they belong to someone who knows his business. That judgment will do for breakfast and perhaps for the rest of the day. You do not need a better compliment than competence. The town will want light with its porridge. Kitchens prefer tallow. Workshops accept it. And the convent keeps to beeswax because some things deserve their sweetness. The parish clerk will come sooner or later with his careful list of tapers. You allow yourself the smallest smile at a neighbor's certainty. A thin slice of potato under a candle, he says, keeps the dripping modest. Another swears a quick dip in brine does the same, as if the sea could teach fat good manners. The two beliefs wave to each other across your mind and sit down. You do not argue with harmless ideas that make people feel competent. They are like steady customers. They take up space near the door and do no harm while the day gets on with itself. Before you trouble the stove, you let the morning finish arriving. The silence is not empty. It is merely well behaved. You sort the day in your head, dipping first, molds later, deliveries if the road feels kind, and the plan nods back as if it recognizes you. In the margin of your thoughts, a little ledger writes itself. Counts of wick, ounces of beeswax, tallow promised to the inn where drafts undo cheap light. Historians still argue Whether homes here adopted sulfur matches early or kept to tinderboxes out of thrift, well into mid-century, you use a serviceable tinderbox and consider the matter settled for this morning. You glance outside once more. A boy hauls a small sled. The runner sings a thin note on hard snow and then is quiet. The sky is a pale lid that is not decided to open. Your breath softens, no longer pretending to be smoke. You take a calm step toward the stove because the morning is ready to be helped along, and you are ready to help it. Heroics do not suit a candle seller. Constancy does. You lift the lid, listen for the small iron complaint, and promise a gentle fire, nothing theatrical. You kneel to the black iron as if it were an old friend pretending not to notice you. The stove gives a small metallic sigh when you lift the lid, a sound that says it knew you were coming and would like quiet recognition. Yesterday's coals idle under a pale roof of ash, thinking over what they did last night and finding nothing to regret. You ease a spoon through the soft drift, uncover a shy orange, and feed it a twist of tow so it may remember its responsibility. Heat is merely memory persuaded to work. Kindling waits in a split box, ends carved to feathery curls. You choose the well-behaved sticks first, the ones that accept flame without dramatics. Birch bark sits like folded paper, eager to flatter any spark with quick applause. You build a neat corner of order where there was only potential, because mornings prefer simple hierarchies: ember, tinder, kindling, log. The bellows lift and settle. Air finds the ember's pride and convinces it to become fire, which is the whole point of an ember. Warmth is a slow negotiation. You set the first thin log so the flame may consider it without feeling hurried. Smoke tests the flue, steps into the pipe, and proceeds as if it had an appointment it intends to keep. Your breath leaves in smaller clouds now, less certain of its talent for theatrics. The iron begins to remember last winter's lessons, heat at first like a rumor, then like a statement. You rest your palms on the rim and feel your knuckles loosen, like stubborn neighbors agreeing to meet halfway in a snow-choked lane. Iron has its own counsel. You listen to quick ticks along the plates, the low hum where the stovepipe passes through the collar, the little cough in the ash drawer. There is a sequence to this music. You turn the damper to its trustworthy notch, because you are a creature of habits that work, and the stove is a citizen of your small republic that prefers laws to enthusiasm. A faint breath of resin from the log offers a pine sweetness, and agrees to practice being comfort before attempting anything like pride. You hold your palms just close enough to prove you are still in charge of them. Fingertips prickle, then settle. Wrists unknot. The day becomes plausible. You unbutton your cuffs, roll the sleeves, and decide the morning now considers you trustworthy. On the chair back, your mittens wait like folded wings. You slide them on and off again to test the promise of heat, then lay them near the stove's shoulder so they will be ready to serve sensibly instead of sulking with damp. The room widens as the chill retreats to the corners. Window frost loosens one fern at a time as though it has remembered a prior appointment. A narrow crack in the farboard answers warmth with a smaller line, which feels like polite conversation. The stove holds the middle of the room with the authority of bread on a table. You take a tin mug, pour a little water, and set it on the back plate to persuade cold into something you can drink without bargaining. Tools prefer the company of warmth. You move the pewter molds closer but not too close, because pewter likes to think it is delicate, and you see no harm in granting the illusion. Dipping rods lean against the wall where the draft collects. They will be grateful later when the room asks them to behave. Your knife rides your whetstone twice, almost for the comfort of the motion more than necessity. Wickedness is not required of a wick knife, only reliability. The blade accepts this with quiet pride. You allow yourself a side thought, because mornings tolerate one. A neighbor swears without ever tiring of swearing, that a pinch of salt scattered on the coals keeps the popping quiet and the soot respectful. Another claims a slice of potato set on the back plate promises luck with drafts. The two ideas tip their hats to each other from opposite sides of your mind, and then lean against the same door. You do not evict them. Harmless superstition dries as well as mittens, and sometimes keeps a person company. Your breath loses its smoke play entirely now. The first thin log declines into emberhood. Without complaint, you add another that knows its duty. You sweep a fine ridge of ash from the hearth lip into the drawer. Smooth the iron top with a rag that refuses to be young, and nudge the tinderbox deeper on the shelf away from any ambition it might have to be warm. The light from your candle stub finds a luster on the stove's edge and seems satisfied with the friendship. You spend a quiet minute in the ceremony of hands. You turn the palms in, then out. Rotate each finger as if it belonged to a separate citizen with its own petition. The knuckles begin to behave. The feeling returns not as a flood, but as a council meeting that finally reaches agreement. You can coil wick without dropping it. You can hold a rod without grudging the weight. A day of careful work pretends to be possible, and you allow the pretense to stand, which is polite of you. Some sounds travel farther once there is warmth to carry them. A sleigh bell from the lane touches the window and slides off. A gull argues with itself in the pale distance over the river. From a nearby yard, a shovel lifts a slab of snow and decides to keep it. The neighborhood's small declarations fall into order, as if the stove has sorted them with its quiet grammar. You respect any grammar that does not require pen and ink. At the back of your mind, history keeps its own ledger, and you let it mutter a line for the scholars, who will someday pretend to know your kitchen. Historians still argue whether stoves like yours spread through the countryside at the same pace as in the towns, or whether remote parishes kept full hearths burning long after city families had moved to iron boxes and pipe. Your attention, however, belongs to this stove in this room on this morning, which is the only jurisdiction you recognize. Heat thickens. The mug steams without drama. You lift it, you warm your mouth. You agree that life has improved by a careful inch. The plates of the stove glow only in imagination. They are too modest for spectacle. Still, you feel how the air in the room changes its weight-like moves with less complaint. Breath meets less resistance. The stove remains a black sermon preached without words. Now that your fingers remember their trade, the day arranges itself like stacked wood. You think about tallow to be rendered to clarity, and beeswax to be melted to gold. You think about wicks measured by thumb and span, about rods weighed by growing candles, about the walk to market once the sky decides to be a proper color. You are not in a hurry. You are only aligned with your tools, which is the closest thing to speed you require. You close the lid with the care of someone ending a conversation that went well. The damper rests at its loyal notch. Mittens have revived. The window offers a faint blue to the frost that remains, which is the window's way of admitting defeat. Your hands are no longer strangers to themselves. You set the mug down, roll your sleeves again just because the motion pleases you, and tell the room without needing to say anything that you are ready to begin treating light as something you can make. You stand between shelf and table and let your eyes do the first weighing. Inventory prefers to be looked at before it is touched, like a patient horse that remembers your hand. Cakes of tallow sit in their linen wrappers, each one a quiet promise of usefulness rather than charm. The beeswax rests heavier and more reserved, gold blurred to amber where the cloth pressed its weave. Coils of wick, pale and obedient, lie in a shallow box that smells faintly of soap, hemp, and the salt of the hand that twisted them. You listen to the room all the while, the small stove ticking, a draft nosing the door latch, the river thinking in the distance. The light from your candle stub finds surfaces, gently proves they are still there, and asks nothing further. You loosen the first tallow parcel. The cake shows a clean, bone-colored face with a modest sheen, not greedy with grease, not chalked with age. You press a thumb to the rim firm, but willing, and bring it near your nose. It offers that plain, stable scent of rendered fat that has done its duty. No edge of sourness, no whisper of the yard. You turn the cake over and look for clouding where indecision might have hidden during the boil. There is little to scold. The knife lifts a thin shaving. It bends and does not crumble. You set the sliver back with a small domestic mercy, as if returning a borrowed thought. Beeswax comes next, and you open the parcel as if unwrapping a soft afternoon. The block keeps small dents from last season's ceiling and a few flecks of comb that do no harm. A faint bloom rests on one face, a tender frost that beeswax grows when it sleeps in cool storage. You take a square of flannel and stroke it once. The bloom walks away, and the gold returns, as though the wax has remembered itself at your suggestion. You press a corner and listen for the dry tack that promises a clean bite. It answers with a polite click. The scent is summer without bravado, meadow, hive, a breath of smoke from remembered honey. You weigh without the scale first, because your arms know their work. Tallow answers your lift with familiar willingness. Beeswax pulls with a friendly gravity. When the balance finally comes out, it agrees with your bones, which is all you ask of a tool. A chalk mark on the shelf 2, 4, 6 invites numbers to the day without giving them too much honor. The ledger will receive the figures tonight, when the room is quiet and coins have learned where they wish to sleep. Wit comes forward because light begins as a string that believes in fire. You lift a coil, soft as a nest. These strands are cotton, twisted close for dipping stout enough to guide the flame, humble enough not to command it. You measure by thumb and span. 1, 2, 3. Then the snip that makes a length for household sixes. You draw the cut end across your lip not to taste, but to feel whether the twist runs smooth. A few lengths show small burrs, the faint stubbornness of fiber. You set those aside for draft candles where an eager flame will forgive them. The best lines you bundle with a scrap of cloth, tie crosswise, and lay to the right, because the right has earned that privilege. You sort by duty and destiny. Kitchen candles do not need to show off. They need to stand their post. The indoor begs for a thicker heart, so the flame will quarrel less with wind. Altar tapers accept a finer twist that bows into its own fire and tends itself with tidy manners. You lay the bundles in ranks, and the table begins to show your plan back to you. Fat here, wax there, wicks in patient order, molds and rods standing by like modest soldiers who already know the drill. You turn to the molds and rods. Dipped candles will ask for patience circles from pot to rack. Thin coats learning to be thicker coats until they resemble themselves. Molded candles prefer warm courtesy. Tin or pewter bathed in gentle water, so the first pour does not turn sulky along a cold wall. You inspect the mouths for nicks that might teach a candle to lean wrong. Your thumb finds a slight rise. The whetstone persuades it to behave. A test wick threads through. Peg set. A finger of warm water teaches the line to stand true. The tin answers with a neat ring when tapped, which is tin's way of saying it is willing. Little thieves live in the world, and you make your peace with that by denying them comforts. Tallow invites mice. Mice invite trouble. You keep cakes in crocks with cloth lids snug and place cedar shavings in the crate, because mice dislike opinions that smell like cedar. You sweep the shelf and carry the sweepings outside as if escorting out guests who stayed past good manners. Beeswax, proud creature, ignores the lecture and glows anyway. It has always had the habit of being admired without trying. You pause and let your nose vote again. Tallow still speaks plain truth. Beeswax still offers quiet summer. The wick smells like a rope shop in miniature, clean, fibrous, prepared to help. You melt a spoon of tallow on the stove's back and float a short wick upon it. The flame finds the twist and rises steady, not guttering, not greedy. You trim it with your small scissors and nod. The trial tells you what you needed to hear. The day can proceed without complaint from its materials. Advice collects in a trade the way dust does, gently and without asking. A neighbor once insisted, stern as a parish rule, that wiping the inside of a tin mold with the cut side of an onion would charm the wax into letting go clean, without pits or sulks. You tried it. Nothing terrible happened. The candles emerged honest. The onion made no new enemies. The habit stayed. Another swears by a whisper of soap. Another by breathing across the mouth of the mold as though speaking kindly to metal helps it remember generosity. You grant space to all three notions. Harmless ideas do no harm on a shelf. The kettle in the corner clears its throat. You oblige with a few scraps meant for later rendering. You set the beeswax where the warmth is suggestion rather than command. You slide the tallow cakes into the crock again and smooth the cloth. You fold the flannel and tuck it away for the next bloom that forgets its shine. You straighten the box of wick and lay a small stone upon the edge so the loops will not learn bad habits from the draft near the door. In small houses, even stones have office. You look again at the coils. Some you buy by the hank from a man who claims his twist keeps better time than a metronome, though you do not say metronome, because such a word has not yet asked to live here. Some you twist yourself on long evenings when hands still want a task, and the stove still has a margin of patience. Historians still argue whether households here adopted the newer flat-braided, self-tending wicks early, or whether the simple twist remain king in these parishes through stubborn affection and the price of thread. Your candles burn either way, and your customers sleep either way. Which settles the matter for you. Before you finish, you listen for faults that prefer to hide. You tap each mold for a bright ring. You lift each rod for a dry rattle. You press each crock lid until you hear the soft kiss that means a seal. You wipe the table with a damp cloth and collect the crumbs of wax before they learn to be everywhere at once. A little draft prowls along the floor from the door to the rack. You note the path and decide where the rods will rest between dips so the breeze will teach cooling and not mischief. The chalk returns to your hand and leaves plain words. Tallow sound, beeswax sound, wick sound, molds and rods sound. The shelf looks back at you with the quiet of a field cut and stacked before weather. You feel that modest satisfaction that arrives when nothing requires fixing. The morning opens its palm and shows you the next step. Wicks to be looped on rods, tin to be warmed in gentle water, patience to be worn smooth like a handle. You breathe once, as you do when paying a small debt in exact coin, and the room, pleased with your manners, makes ready for work. You set the kettle at the back of the stove, where water thinks slowly and never feels hurried. The hook takes the weight with a small iron complaint, which is only fair. It was asked to be useful before breakfast. Fat weights in a crock bits trimmed yesterday at the butcher's block. A small hoard of kitchen drippings saved in jars. A modest pail from the inn where pans confess what they have been up to. You tip the pail pieces into the water and hear the quiet hiss as cold meets warm and learns its place. Nothing dramatic happens, which is the proper mood for a morning that plans to last. The kettle begins its steady murmur, less a boil than a thoughtful conversation. Steam rises with a faint, sweet heaviness and writes its name on the window's frost with one finger. You take up your long spoon, the one with a handle burnished by years of explaining things to fat, and you move the pieces so they will not cling to the bottom out of shyness. Bits of suet pretend to be stones before admitting their destiny. You keep circling like a parish clerk counting heads without hurrying anyone. You skim at the first sign of froth, because froth is the part of a job that always wants to be admired for nothing. The edge of your spoon gathers it, bright and pointless, and you pour it into a small bowl destined for the yard. The kettle approves by settling back into its quiet talk. A gray rim walks around the edge, and you invite it off with the flat of your spoon. The surface smooths, and the smell grows homely, like a kitchen that pays attention to itself. You add a dipper of clean water because you are not trying to rush clarity. You are offering it a seat. Rendering with water keeps the tallow from scorching and teaches impurities to float where a spoon can make gentle law. The fat cubes loosen their pride and become glossy cards drifting in a patient deck. You press one. It yields and slides apart into a map of its former life. The stove keeps the heat low. A tutor who knows the lesson and refuses to shout. You arrange the cloth that will strain later linen washed thin as advice, tied into a hoop you bent from willow last spring. A smooth stone waits to weight it when the time comes, because cloth likes to be reminded of its obligations. On the table, a pan holds a shallow bath of warm water to welcome the clean tallow when it arrives, so it will cool without sulking and set without showing off. You have learned that materials behave best when the room treats them as expected guests. Outside, the lane creaks under sled runners. A gull sighs and decides the river is not ready for conversation. You keep your hand moving, tracing patient circles. A plain, serviceable fact sits by the stove. In 19th century Quebec, most household candles begin in kettles like this beef or mutton tallow, rendered with water over steady iron, then cooled, trimmed, and taught to burn. You give the fact a chair. It takes up little space and helps the day behave. Now and then, you lift the spoon and let a clear drop fall back. It lands with a small, approving wink. When the pieces have given up their greed, the cracklings turn modest and brown. You herd them to one side and praise their cooperation with silence. The kettle no longer smells like ambition, only like work completed. You skim once more for tidiness than necessity, because tidiness outlasts enthusiasm. There is a superstition you tolerate, because it does not ask for rent. Some insist that floating a heel of stale bread in the kettle draws specks and grit to itself like a polite magnet. Others prefer a slice of raw potato, claiming it speaks a language impurities respect. You have tried both, and cannot swear to miracles, but neither offends, and the bread emerges heroic and unlovely. Harmless ideas may share the kitchen as long as they mind their manners. When the fat looks like a small polished pond, you lift the kettle by its ears and pour with 2 hands. The cloth receives the stream and bows only slightly, the willow hoop holding its temper. The first rush brings a few impatient flecks, then the flow runs gold to winter, sun color steady and clear. You do not chase the last dregs. The last dregs enjoy being chased and reward the chase by being disappointing. You leave a little goodness behind so the whole may be better. The strained tallow rests in its pan of warm welcome. You touch the surface with a spoon and watch the ripple pull itself smooth, a small vanity you allow. The cracklings freed of their wealth cool on a slab of bread for a neighbor's hen, or, if you are feeling prodigal, for your own jaw. They are not noble food, only loyal. You fold the straining cloth and carry it to the basin, washing the heat out and the day's small pride in. Linens remember kindness and pay interest in usefulness. You think about customers without summoning any of them by name. The inn will be glad of stout 6s that behave in draft. A seamstress prefers 8s for a fine, modest light. The parish clerk will want beeswax for the feast and tallow for the sacristy steps, plain truths that manage their duties without applause. You tilt the pan until the clear layer declares itself from any sediment that dreamed of staying. Sediment may keep dreams. It may not enter candles. A quiet uncertainty has lived in your trade longer than anyone will admit, and it finds your ear while you wipe the rim. Historians still argue whether households here favored beef tallow above mutton for most candles, or whether mixtures shifted with season and supply winter butcherings lending beef its voice. Summer kitchens saving every kind of dripping for the same pot. You have rendered both and burned both. The flame tells you differences, but not quarrels. You keep to what the week gives, and call that wisdom. You set the pan of clear tallow where it keeps warm like a quiet thought, then draw the shallow box of wick across the table. Cotton coils unroll without argument, pale and calm, the twist remembering hands that spun it far from this river. Your measuring stick, a span worn smooth by years of agreeing with your thumb marks the first length. 3 spans for a household 6, 4 for a door-minded draft candle, a touch more for tall tapers that stand straighter when given grace. Scratches serve as numbers, habit serves as rule. You cut because cutting is how intention accepts work. The knife answers with a small click each time it closes the question of length. Strands lie in tidy rows, parallel as furrows. Your breath keeps time with emotion. The stove hums its low sermon. A sleigh bell passes outside and leaves a thin silver scratch on the air. You lift the first bundle to your lips, not to wet it, only to feel the fibers lay. Smooth twist, no burr. It earns its place among the day's tools. Twisting is patience made visible. 2 strands for a modest kitchen light, 3 for a bolder heart. You roll the length beneath your palm until the fibers agree to be one mind. Then reverse the lay a few strokes, so the twist will not rush into mischief when warmed. Held up to the candle, a good wick shows a quiet backbone, neither drooping nor bristling. A whisker trimmed from the end falls without fuss, like a thought finished speaking. Some lengths you plate, not for fashion, but because certain flames prefer it. Beeswax tapers at the altar keep their own ash when the plate is even and fine. Kitchen candles facing drafts prefer a stouter twist that speaks the language of stubborn air. You sort the families into little nests, plated here, twisted there, thick for the inn, thin for prayer, middling for soup and sewing. The table becomes a map of quiet intentions. Now you prime them. A dip into warm tallow teaches each length to remember straightness. You lower both ends together, lift, and let excess fall in 2 small streams. Soft rope turns politely firm, like a thought set in writing. They hang across the warming rod by the door, where the draft is gentle, and a cloth beneath catches any strays. When they cool, you smooth each with your fingers, so the lesson will hold. You keep count, because light is bought by number. A dozen shorter for the seamstress who cannot spare coin. A dozen longer for the schoolmaster who dislikes trimming before children learning letters. Now and then, a single solemn length for a cradle or a waiting window. Each dozen is coiled and bound with a strip of paper marked in pencil. The figures are small, the promise plain, the bundles like pale straw stacked for winter. A comfortable truth sits beside the knife. Through this century in Lower Canada, cotton wicks serve most household candles, twisted or plaited to suit tallow or beeswax and the temper of the room. You do not announce the fact. You nod to it while the next bundle cools. Cotton holds flame kindly and forgives small mistakes. Linen is dutiful, hemp stubborn. Cotton seems to like people, and people trust it in return. Pet notions arrive with every trade, and you let them warm themselves. An old woman taught you to draw a new wick through a dish of beeswax, while murmuring the day of the week, because wax likes to know where it stands. Another ties dozens with horsehair to prevent tangling and quarrels. Horsehair looks trustworthy, though paper serves you well. A riverman swears a pinch of salt rubbed along a wick keeps smoke modest. The idea stays, because harmless ideas earn their shelf. You check each primed length for evenness. The finger finds slight lumps the eye neglects. If a place is fat, you roll it between thumb and nail until it minds. If thin, you pair it with a neighbor and twist them tenderly together. Test wicks. Thread the tin molds, drawn true with a small peg at the bottom. No kinks, no stubborn bends. The line must listen to metal without becoming its servant. Palms rest on the table. Satisfaction travels quietly up the arms. The window admits more day. Frost loosens with a soft crackle like distant footsteps. Finished bundles lie in a row, for a moment like wheat laid to dry. It pleases you that something so simple will later persuade darkness to behave. A prime sample meets a candle flame, catches and burns with a calm cup of light. After a time, you trim the little mushroom of char and watch the ash fall with minimal complaint. A well-chosen wick saves a household an evening's patience. Beyond your bench, trade runs its long roads as weather does. Historians still argue whether cotton wicks here were mostly brought by river merchants or spun in homes from linen or hemp well into the middle decades, and whether plaited, self-tending styles settled early in parish shops or later, after town sellers made a habit of them. Your ledger knows the answer for this morning. Cotton in the bundle, true in its lay, ready to serve without asking to be praised. The last task is modest. You rub a flake of beeswax between finger and thumb and draw it lightly along each coil, not to glaze it, but to promise order. The smell is a small field under a sun that is not here yet. You stack the coils like rope aboard a sensible boat, set a flat stone on the box so the draft will not lift a loose end into mischief, and sweep fiber crumbs into your palm for the hearth. The table returns to plain wood. The knife and stick return to their places. Your hands feel orderly too. You bring the rods to the table the way you set out plates for a quiet supper. Not to impress anyone, only to give the hands what they expect. Each rod is a good length of wood, rubbed smooth by years of work, its ends shouldered with little pegs that will rest on the rack's rails. A shallow groove runs along the top where wicks like to sit. You planed it years ago, hardly more than a suggestion, but enough to keep order from wandering. The trestles wait, square and unremarkable. You lay the first rod across them, and the room seems to nod as if it has seen this done often, and approves of your continued loyalty to simple methods. The prepared lengths wait in their nests, primed and calm, the twist already taught not to argue. You lift one by the middle and find the balance point with your thumb. Two ends hang like obedient tails. You settle the middle into the groove and press with a fingernail so it will remember where home is. Then you choose a neighbor for it and leave a span of air between them, because symmetry begins before dipping, not after. Spacing is a kind of courtesy you can see, and you have no quarrel with courtesies that cost nothing and return peace. You work in pairs, because dipped candles enter the world 2 by 2, learning weight together until a knife parts them without ceremony. 12 pairs to a rod suits your shoulders. 15 makes you ambitious and invites sighing, which has never finished a task. You mark the rod lightly with chalk small commas, confessing where each loop should land, and your hand finds the distance without measuring or debate. Later, the sleeve's honest side will wipe the marks away. No one needs to know how you persuaded neatness to appear. First loops behave. At the apex where the wick bends over the rod, you make a pinch, not a knot. Only a reminder to keep the crown tidy. A good loop sits like a question mark turned humble. If one side hangs a finger's width longer, you stroke the shorter end between thumb and nail until it agrees to match. The table answers with a tiny thump each time you set a loop, as if counting in a language of wood. Outside, a runner scrapes stone. Inside, the stove offers its low mutter of approval. The room's small noises stand in a line and wait their turn. Some rods carry a spacer, a simple comb you cut from scrap tin, notched by guess and file. To keep the loops at even intervals, you slide it along now and then to test your eye. It agrees more often than not, which is the kind of praise you trust. When a loop wants to wander, you correct it without scolding. Later, when fat begins to collect, a small error will grow into a habit, and you prefer to fix habits while they are shy. You sight along the rod as a carpenter might, then turn it end for end to see whether truth keeps itself from both directions. The rack waits by the door, where the draft keeps a polite distance. Its rails wear shallow valleys from years of supporting tiny futures of light. You lift the first dressed rod and rest it there as if greeting a bench after a long walk. The loops hang in a straight school, all heads pointing the same way. You return to the table for the next rod and teach it the same manners. Soon a small choir of white pairs hangs in order, a chorus that has not learned words, but already understands time. You keep your hands clean, because grease on fingers will later smudge the first coats, and smudge becomes pattern, and pattern becomes complaint. A basin of warm water waits near your elbow. You dip, wipe, and continue. The motion is slow enough to be remembered, quick enough that your mind does not wander into foolishness. You count under your breath by twos, the only arithmetic that matters here. 2, 4, 6, 8 practice for sales later, when dozens wish to be counted with dignity. Breath and numbers share one task and do not interfere with each other. You listen for the faint twine squeak. That means the fiber is primed, but not stiff. Too stiff, and a loop will crack when cooled. Too soft, and it will twist into sulks. The right state is merely willing. You run your palm lightly down each pair, from crown to tail, promising the idea of straightness. The wick answers with a soft thread sound, a small whisper that says it remembers. Snowlight thins across the floorboards and makes the hanging pairs look like white bells that have not yet found a reason to ring. Trade collects peculiarities and keeps them like buttons in a tin. A neighbor rubs his rods with the faintest dusting of ash, insisting it teaches first coats to let go without ragged edges. Another swears by a wipe of goose fat, thin as rumor, before the first dip, claiming it makes the surface polite. You have tried both and kept neither as law. A clean rod and a steady room treat you well. Still, you allow the ash and the goose fat to live on your shelf of tolerable ideas, near the onion that fools tin molds elsewhere, and the horsehair some people use to tie dozens. Harmless notions pay their rent in conversation and leave the work unchanged. You test the balance of a dressed rod in your palms. The paired ends sway once, twice, then decide to be still. You imagine the weight that will arrive after the 5th dip, the 10th, the 15th the way. Shoulders will note the difference and say nothing, because they have said it all before. The muscle of the day begins in silence and stays there. Your back learns the sermon without complaint. One rod joins another on the rack, and the space near the door becomes a quiet orchard of pale hanging fruit. You inspect the crowns where the loops bend. Any that splay too eagerly will grow a flat place when fat gathers. You nip the crown and smooth it so later trimming will be less theatrical. You tamp each pair, a fingertips nudge, to center them over their chalk commas. There is a rightness you can feel before you can see, and you trust that faculty, as you trust the sound a good blade makes when it chooses yes. You take the tin comb once more, and let its teeth walk along the rod. It finds almost nothing to complain about, which is precisely enough. Between rods, you indulge in small maintenance that looks like fidgeting, and is not. You scrape a whisper of wax from the groove, and polish it with a rag, so the next dozen will sit as obediently as the first. You rinse the rag, hang it on its nail, and notice the kettle's voice deepen from background to invitation. The iron mixes its own breath with the room's, and the draft at the door bows without mischief. Everything that can be patient is patient. When the last rod is dressed, you walk the line the way a person checks doors before night, not out of fear, only out of respect for wood and fiber. The rods speak their tiny creaks. The loops answer with cotton whispers. You stand a moment with empty hands, so they will be glad to be given work again. The ledger will receive pairs later, not singles. Dozens will become coin, and then groceries, and then another coil of wick, which is how light feeds itself. For now, you chalk a neat note on the board. 5 rods, 12 pairs each. The numbers look small and trustworthy, exactly how you like numbers to behave. Scholarship likes to have its say, even in a room that prefers tasks to debates. Historians still argue whether small parish shops here adopted metal notch spacers and manufactured brooches early in the century, or whether most makers kept to plain wooden rods and chalk marks well into later decades, trusting eye and hand more than any clever aid. You look at your groove, your chalk, your tin comb with its homely teeth, and decide the hand remains the better authority this morning. The hand votes. The rods agree, and the day accepts the result. A final check, a final breath. You press one loop and release it. It returns to center without sulking. The rods hold their level line. The rack stands like an altar with modest ambitions, and the door's draft suggests cooling rather than command. You wipe chalk from your fingers, set the comb aside, and rest your palms on the table until the kettle's voice changes from almost to ready. The day lifts its chin. The first dip waits. You lift the first rod as if it were a sentence you intend to speak plainly. The kettle quivers, not boiling, only thinking which is the right temper for fat that means to be useful. Steam touches your wrist. You lower the wicks until their crowns kiss the surface, then let the rest follow, slow enough that no bubble tries to earn a story. The first dip is only a whisper that tells cotton to stop being only cotton. You raise the rod and let the pale strings drip their brief wealth back into the mouth of the kettle. A thin film clings shy, undecided, then keeps its nerve. You carry the rod to the rack by the door, where the draft behaves like a steady ant, cool, watchful, not unkind. The wicks stiffen enough to remember they have a future. You return without hurry. Haste has never lengthened a candle. The circuit becomes your morning. Kettle to rack, rack to kettle. You pass the stove as if nodding to a parish elder. It answers by doing nothing, which is also approval. Lower, lift, wait, walk. The room accepts the pattern, as though it had been waiting for precisely this choreography and no other. Second dip, and film becomes coat. The rods grow whisper heavier. Your fingers adjust before they think about it. You watch for the bright trickle that tattles about a trapped bubble at the crown. Nonecoms. The pairs line up like boys, reminded how to stand before a bell. Shine cools to quiet mat. Clean fat and warm tin make the air homely. Heat wanders the way stories do, so you mind the kettle. Too hot, the coats streak. Too cool, the skin peels like gossip. Today the balance holds. One pass of the spoon is not correction, only reassurance, like smoothing hair already tidy. The surface nods and grows calm again. Third dip, and the pairs learn to have a center. They swing less, hang with purpose, ask less of your fingers. All those small bodies of future light look briefly like white birds returned from a sensible distance. Outside, the window sheds an inch of frost. The lane sharpens. Inside, work continues as if it had started yesterday and only paused to sleep. You count by rounds rather than numbers, first, second, third words that keep company instead of score. Your shoulders learn the conversation in the rods. The weight increases by the kind of fraction only hands can measure. It is not a burden. It is the cost of teaching a thing what it is. Fourth dip invites a pause at the rack. A drip clings with more pride than sense. The back of your nail ends the drama. A pair leans toward a neighbor. The tin comb gives one prudent tooth of advice. Pegs sit square. Chalk commas keep their promise. The line stands true. You may proceed. Fifth and sixth dips need no commentary. The kettle returns what rendering gave it: clarity and patience. When you lift, faint meniscus lines show where the liquid let go. You adjust the entry by a breath, so those rings lay into smoothness instead of laddering into complaint. Small corrections are the respectable kind. Trades keep pocket habits. Without deciding to, you walk the circuit sunwise. An older hand once taught you to dip the first pair twice, one for the candle, one for the person who will need it most. You still allow the double at the start. Luck has not objected. By the seventh dip, the pairs ask to be called by their duties. 6 is for kitchens, Eighths for sewing. Stout lengths for the indoor that quarrels with weather. Cooling grows easier as the bodies thicken. They accept the next coat without sulk. Your palms warm the wood. The wood warms your palms. Everyone is content. The scissors stand ready for mischief. A lip tries to grow into a crooked shoulder. You level it. One tail wants to be longer. You whisper it back to equality. These are reminders, not scoldings. Candles like being reminded. Most things do. Walk, dip, lift, wait, walk. A sleigh passes and fades. The river clears its throat once and decides there is nothing urgent to say. Inside, that becomes intention one coat at a time, like a policy that works because no one brags about it. 9th and 10th dips settle. A test pinch between thumb and forefinger yields a little, and then holds. Good. You set the rod back. The wedge hushes a small creak. A thin sheen builds on the kettle's shoulder. You wipe it off so it will not flake into the next round. A spoon of clear tallow keeps depth. The rim receives a tap the way a table receives grace. You look once more at the meniscus rings and at your hands. There is no rule book on the wall. The only measures are breath, eye, and the small patience you carry from winter to winter. You smooth a crown with the pad of your thumb. Turn the rod end for end and let the draft finish what you started. Work agrees to continue because you did not ask it to hurry. Patience remains for several more circuits. The rods wait like polite geese along the rail. The first coat became the second. The second became the third. And now the 10th is ready to introduce the 11th without embarrassment. You lower the pairs again, as slow as manners, and the kettle gives a small approving breath. You stand by the door where the rails live, the part of the room that tells the truth first. The cooling poles hold the dressed rods at shoulder height, wood worn to satin by years of small weight. The draft here is not a nuisance, but a helper. A thin, steady breath walked in from the lane and bent by the door's honest cracks. It is colder than the rest of the room and more forthright. Your breath makes a dim cloud and then thinks better of it. You test the air with the back of your hand, though you already know what it will say. Cooler near the jamb, cooler still just above the lower rail, calm at the head. The first pairs hang like pale switchgrass, thin coats firming from shine to hush. A small sway moves through them when the door settles. They answer by standing straighter, as if they have decided to behave. Cooling is a discipline that does not raise its voice. Too quick, and the skin scabs. Too slow, and a flat is born where roundness should be. You lift the nearest rod, reverse it end for end, and set it down again. The turn lets each shoulder meet the air it has not yet met. Seems quiet. The wood gives a little creak that might be approval or memory. You accept both. Small faults prefer this stage, and you catch them while they are still embarrassed. A bead clings to a tail. A twist of your fingers takes it away before it hardens into a seed of smoke. A pear leans toward its neighbor like a gossiping cousin. The tin-combed teeth bent by your own file takes one polite bite of distance. At one crown, the bend tries to make itself a hinge. Your warm thumb presses a thought of smoothness into it. The rack has stations like pews. New coats begin at the top rail, where the draft is light. As they thicken, you lower them to the middle, and then to the bottom, where the air is franker. A rod that moves down too soon will pucker. A rod that lingers will learn to remember the rail. You are not interested in memory. You want obedience. The door participates. You open it 2 fingers width and close it again, so the hinge may sing its low iron note. Winter noses in, attentive but mannerly. Along the tails, the sheen dulls to satin, which is the look you trust. Candles should not admire themselves. They should look ready to work. Trades also collect amusements. A neighbor keeps a goose wing on a nail and fans the rods 3 strokes after every round, never 4. Another brushes a crown drip with a pinch of clean snow to teach it its manners. You keep a wing of your own and use it when the air grows lazy. It offends no one and pleases you. Snow you leave to the street, where it belongs and does its best work. You check the lower rail, reserved for stouter pairs that will stand in doorways and argue with weather. The draft down here is straightforward. You lift a rod and feel the brief tug of cold asking for order. The pairs answer by settling. A fingertip persuades a faint ridge to forget it ever existed. You hang the rod again and look along the line. The silhouettes match in the way that matters. Not perfectly, but cooperatively. Beeswax will have its turn later and asks a different patience. So you lay a strip of linen across a clean place for it. Warm coats should not learn the grain of wood. The cloth lies still, as if it knows the purpose. Courtesy early prevents courtship later. The rag goes back to its nail. The nail minds the wall. The kettle across the room clears its throat, and you move each rod one station downward. Pegs knock softly against wood like quiet taps on a neighbor's door. You step back and sight along the ranks the way a carter checks his team before a hill. Not for beauty, not for cleverness, only for the set of things prepared to pull in the same direction. The draft passes through without apology. Now you practice the most difficult part of the day's labor. You wait without fidgeting. The door leaks winter without malice. Somewhere a sleigh bell hesitates and then continues. The pairs thicken by a patience you can almost hear. You give them exactly enough time, less than idleness. More than hurry, then turn a rod in your hands. And consider the scholars who like to argue while other people make things. Historians still argue whether parish chandlers here set fresh-dipped rods outdoors on still midwinter mornings 1 or 2 breaths to seize the first coats, or whether such tales are boasting the risk of cracking and white bloom, not worth the minutes saved. Before you return to the kettle, you audit without writing. Rods on the top rail are thin and willing. Those in the middle are learning to be round. Those on the bottom are firm enough to be trusted with more. Crowns sit neat, tails behave. The comb has earned its keep. You trade places for 2 rods so the shyer pairs can stand where the draft is braver. Then you thank the door in your head, which is the only way to thank a door, and you take a rod in both hands. Heat will say again what cold just said. Keep your shape. You cross the boards that remember every winter and breathe once for measure. The pairs lift and swing with the quiet confidence of a task that already knows the next step. You return to the kettle that thinks instead of boils, ready to add one more coat to light that has begun to deserve the name. You set a wide pot on the back of the stove and pour in water to a hand's breadth, because metal likes gentle company before it agrees to be kind. Tin molds wait on the table, long and narrow, seams honest, lips lightly rolled. You lower the first into the bath and watch tiny bubbles lift from its sides like forgotten breath. You test with the back of your hand and a private count to 3. Warm, not hot. Friendly, not forward. A mold tempted too high will repay you with ripples you did not order. Another follows, then another, until a ring of rims peeks around the pot like cautious neighbors at a door. Wicks come next, primed lengths, calm from their earlier lesson. You touch the leading inch to warm tallow and twist a point. The point threads the mouth, wanders, and finds daylight again through the tiny hole at the foot. You draw until the crown rests just shy of the lip. A peg seals the bottom. You thumb a bead of tallow putty around the hole so no impatience leaks. Above, a sliver of wick remains for trimming, a small promise of flame. Centering is the difference between tidy and troublesome. You lay a small stick across the mouth and tie the wick to it, then pluck the line so it stands straight. A hair left, a hair right you correct, both with the point of a pin. Each mouth receives its stick, each stick its knot, and a small forest of wicks rises from the warm bath. You lift a mold and swab the inside with clean flannel one unhurried sweep to remove the last bead of water and leave only warmth. Metal that is warm and dry will welcome wax and let it go. Metal that is cold and damp keeps a grudge where everyone can see it. You prefer your grudges invisible. Beeswax waits in its own small pot, liquid gold with a quiet perfume of summer. You test with your wrist the way the wax coats the ladle. Not too eager, not too proud. You do not name a number for heat. The ladle's ribbon tells you enough. You pour as if reading to someone already drifting. The stream is thin and certain. You let it run a finger down the wick first, then fill to a soft dome at the lip a meniscus that will later settle. A knuckle taps the side once, twice, and small bubbles climb like latecomers slipping into a pew. One more tap, and they remember their manners. Each mold receives the same courtesy. If a dribble trails across a rim, you ignore it until it cools, and then whisk it away with the back of the knife. The filled molds return to the bath, water line below their lips so no stray drop will audition for ruin. Warm sides prevent chill lines. Cooler tops settle at their own pace. You look along the row. The domes breathe inward as the wax shrinks to itself. Where the sink is modest, you leave it. Where it is proud, you offer a spoonful more so the base will not wobble later. A peg tightens. A knot is retied. A stick nudged a hair south. Around the trade live notions, no one can swear help, and no one can prove harm. An old hand wraps each mold 3 times with the ladle to wake the tin. Another dips the wick tip in brine, claiming it teaches the first flame modesty. You do the tapping because the sound pleases the room. The brine you leave to neighbors who like salt in their stories. You check for leaks at the pegs, none today, and grant yourself a nod no one sees. The bath keeps the sides temperate, while cores decide who they are. You do not jostle the table. Jostling is a kind of lying. You also do not stare, as if staring could speed cooling. Molds keep promises best when briefly ignored. Spare molds shine on the shelf where a rag found them, dim along seams that remember solder. A tinsmith in town made half your set, and a peddler on the river sold you the rest, or so the tales agree. Historians still argue whether rural chandlers here mostly used locally made tin molds or bought pewter sets carried upriver from Montreal and beyond. And when interchangeable sizes truly became common, your molds answer by working. That settles your share of the debate. When the tops lose their shine and the domes settle nearly flat, you take the wax from the heat and rest your hands on the table's honest scar. The room smells of honey and iron that has learned its manners. Outside, the river tests its ice and chooses patience. Inside, a row of futures waits without asking to be admired. You lift one by its stick just enough to see the seam hold, and the wick stand true. Not yet. Back to the bath. 2 latecomers receive their pour because you kept one eye on the pot while pretending not to. The ladle scrapes the bottom with a sound like a small decision. The remainder hardens in a tin. A day dislikes loose ends. While the last minutes pass, you set out the trimming knife, the block, and the shallow pan, where warm water will welcome the first rinses when the candles come free. Work should greet work like neighbors at a fence, not loud, not shy. The molds soften their shine from wet to satin. The seams quiet. The domes finish their small sigh and level themselves. You test the first mold by lifting its cross-stick and giving the wick a small, reasonable twist. The candle answers by loosening its hold with the softest sigh, as if metal and wax have concluded their brief conversation and found nothing left to say. You ease the taper out, warm tin kissing it along the seam, and it slides into your palm cooler at the skin than it looks, with the faint tack of bees and July still in it. The seam is a thin line you can feel more than see. You lay the newborn on the folded linen you set out earlier, because cloth remembers to be kind when wood forgets. Another follows. A third hesitates, and you return it politely to the bath for a minute, where warmth will teach it to let go without sulking. You do not yank. Yanking is for rope and quarrels. When it slides free, a shallow sink is formed at the base, where cooling drew the heart inward. You pierce the little hollow with a clean pin, pour a spoon's worth of melt into the dimple, and hear the soft tick as the new wax makes peace with the old. A line of small repairs waits on the cloth, like tiny moons that have found their shape. You trim the heels next. The knife's edge is warm from a dip in the pan, so it will persuade rather than tear. One quick, flat stroke and the foot turns true. You set each taper upright on the board to prove itself. A proud one wobbles and earns another patient pass of the blade. The scrapings curl like pale peelings and go back into the little tin to be melted. Because this trade dislikes waste more than it likes opinions. Seams accept a thumb better than a knife. You wet yours in warm water and run it along the faint ridge from mouth to foot. Not to erase the seam truth should remain, but to quiet it. The wax yields with the soft forward feeling of good manners. A second pass, lighter than the first, and the surface shows a calm that will take light without arguing about it. You polish with a piece of flannel until the taper wears a modest satin instead of a brag. The wicks require only fairness. You clip each crown to a sensible length, no exuberant tassels, no stump that would encourage sulky smoke. A row of trimmed black kisses the edge of the pan. You give 2 tapers their second pour at the crowns to fill a discourteous sink, and the new skin tightens as if it had been there all along. Small straightnesses add up. Evening depends on them. You keep count even while your hands pretend they do not. 6, 12, 18 dozens begin to speak their language. For the clerk, you sort lengths in pairs, then in fours, then by the dozen, tying each with a strip of linen tape marked in pencil. The tall ones wear their height unashamed. The smaller keep their utility like a secret. You separate altar lengths from processional, because someone will ask, and you prefer to answer with the quiet authority of a thing done already. The room changes when beeswax steps out of tin. It smells like what the hive remembers. Flour taken seriously, smoke so faint it has nothing to confess, a sweetness that refuses to be loud. The stove's breath mixes with it and becomes less like iron and more like time. You imagine the knave's wood catching this scent on a feast day, a slow cloud edged with brass and winter coats, light rising from each taper, as if that is the only thing light has ever wanted to do. You write the clerk's name on a paper no larger than a playing card and slip it beneath the right bundle. His list showed neat columns, each stroke a careful thought about the holy calendar. He will count your tapers again when you bring them. You will not be offended. Counting is devotion for men who keep keys. You count too, but your devotion ends in hands, not ink. Not everything leaves perfect, not everything should. One taper keeps a shadow line at the seam, visible only if a person stoops to find it. You let the line live. Another shows a faint hourglass where the mold's belly was shy. You straighten it between palms warmed against the stove's shoulder, rolling gently until the shyness forgets itself. The candle thanks you by deciding to look as though it meant to be that way all along. You set aside a pair for the convent because their hall never takes pride in plenty. The sisters will say nothing when you place them on the table. They will nod, the way people nod when the world behaves within the bounds of reason. You also keep one taper for your own shelf, not for waste, not for vanity, only because a person who makes light should know, every so often, what his own room looks like under a good flame that needs little trimming and less excuse. Work leaves its small debris, and you keep even that dignified. Flakes fall into a tin. Threads of wick are gathered with a wetted thumb. The bath is emptied back into a pan, its water clouded with honey gold blur that will settle in the cold if given time. You wipe the rims of the molds and hang them so their throats look down, the better to forget stray drops. Metal that drains sleeps better. The afternoon's chill tastes the door and decides to stay a while. You set the finished tapers in a shallow box, lined with clean straw so they will not learn dents on the road. The box creaks its satisfaction. You tuck a scrap of flannel between layers as a promise against bruising. The lid tests its fit and approves. Your pencil marks the total in the smallest script that can still be honest. Before you turn to tallow again, you light one beeswax taper, because demonstration is a cousin to truth. The flame catches, bows once, and stands. It speaks in a quiet tongue, clear, steady, not given to smoke. You watch it lower by a finger's width and leave a shallow saucer of clean ash at the crown. Exactly the kind of manners you had hoped for. A breath trims it. It thanks you by staying itself. You set a low fire for the tallow. That will do most of the day's plain work. The clear cakes from the morning slide into the kettle with the quiet of cooperation. Yesterday's savings arrive in their small tin, already filtered and patient. You give them heat the way you offer someone a seat, gentle, as if you have time, because you do. Fat learns again what it learned earlier, loosening into a pool that takes the shape of its container and asks nothing complicated in return. The spoon draws patient circles. The surface follows as if it has been waiting all morning to agree with something. Steam gives the window a soft hand. The stove keeps its sermon low. Blending is only a series of decisions you refuse to hurry. Beef suet tallow gives backbone and a tidy set. Mutton brings steadiness with a stronger voice. The jar from the inn, saved from pans and trimmings, adds thrift, if not elegance. You weigh each by eye and by how your hands remember last month's burn. A spoon of beeswax, no more than a kindness, finds the kettle to quiet smoke and teach the shoulders to stand. The summer gold vanishes into the pail. Only the scent admits it still has opinions. The ladle lifts and shows a ribbon that smooths itself before it can think of sulk. You nod once, because nodding suits fat better than praise. You test readiness with 3 modest tricks. The first is the thumbprint. A drop on a cool plate Counted to 10, pressed. If it yields and then holds, you allow it to join the day. The second is the bend, a thin ribbon cooled in your breath and flexed without crumbling. The third is the listening test, which is not a test at all. When the surface forgets to shimmer and lies like a pond at evening, it is ready to work. Numbers would make a parade of this. You prefer manners. The kettle understands and answers by doing exactly enough. Ratios belong to the day, not to a book. For kitchen sixes that keep a stew pot company without swagger, you let beef speak loudest and ask mutton to be agreeable in the background. For the inn's drafted doorway that harasses weak flames, you stiffen the blend another spoon of beef, another whisper of wax, the kind of firmness that answers weather, as if weather were a rude cousin. For sewing candles, you lighten the body a shade, because eyes have enough labor without correcting a smoky conscience. The kettle receives each judgment without commentary and keeps the pool mild. You keep a little tin aside for trials and pour 3 thimble cups. 3 short wicks learn their fate on a pewter saucer. The first flame bows and steadies, a good student. The second blooms too eagerly and writes a gray thought on the air when the door considers a draft. The third tunnels a little and asks to be trimmed almost at once. You take the second back to the kettle and add a spoon of backbone. You let the third thicken half a thought and try again. The saucer collects tiny halos of ash, none of them proud. A house that buys your dozens will never see these rehearsals, which is the point of rehearsals. Advice the trade did not ask for still visits. A neighbor swears a pinch of sifted wood ash whisked into the pool keeps drips modest, as if fat fears becoming mud. Another insists the spoon must always travel sunwise, or the wick will sulk and canoe. You stir sunwise out of habit, and because it costs nothing to be agreeable to harmless convictions. The ash you leave alone. Order earned by cleanliness outlasts tricks. If a notion behaves like tidiness, it may stay. If it behaves like cleverness, it can find another stove. When the pool clears to a winter sun color, you skim the thin film that forms whenever talk has gone on long enough and needs to be ended. A kettle that looks like a mirror gives better coats. You lower the heat until the surface behaves like a patient pond and not like soup. The spoon rests across the rim, a bridge between decisions. You prefer bridges to leaps. A breath from the door crosses the room and fails to bother anyone. You set the trial saucer aside, satisfied with the steadiness and the small, well-mannered drip that breaks clean instead of greasy. Beneath the window, the rods of pale loops wait for their next lesson. Blending changes the day's weight. The 5th and 6th rounds will settle differently now that the candle has begun to be itself. You lift a rod, feel the small arithmetic increase, and accept it the way a person accepts winter. Not with applause, not with complaint, only with sleeves already rolled. The first pass into the tempered pool leaves a skin that knows what it is doing. The second smooths the faint rings from earlier and sets the shoulders so trimming will be nothing but courtesy later on. The rack by the door receives the rod with its usual creak that might be approval, might be memory. You set a few molds near the bath to catch what dipping will not use, because a room that makes light should leave as little orphan fat as possible. The molds receive a quieter blend, a little more beeswax, a little less mutton, so the seam will lie shy and the foot will stand without wobble. A stick across each mouth keeps the wick in the patient middle, which is where most virtues live. You tap each side, because tapping pleases you and offends no one. The row of waiting throats looks like modest trumpets holding their breath. While the rods cool, you trim one of the test flames and listen to its voice. A good blend speaks softly and says the same thing over and over without becoming boring. The saucer bears a small lacrima of clear tallow at the base. No proud rivers, no tantrums. You press a fingertip into the drip and it breaks like a thin pain, not greasy, not chalked. That is the candle confirming what your hands already know, which never hurts. Another pinch of wick becomes a curl on the plate, neat as a comma. You let the little pool of light keep you company while the rack does its quiet work. You allow yourself one private amusement. There is a belief, old as any shed, that stirring with a hazel stick prevents tunneling and keeps a wick honest. Another charm drops a small horseshoe nail into the kettle to make the tallow brave. The hazel suits your hand and does not scratch the pot. The nail stays in the drawer, where brave things belong when not in use. The kettle, unaffected, goes on doing good work. People like stories. Fat likes heat and patience. Each keeps to its nature, and the day thanks them both. Questions braid themselves in from a distance, the way church bells do. Historians still argue whether stearin blends made from separated fats and prized for hardness found ordinary use in rural parishes here before lamps and store-bought candles made the question irrelevant, or whether such refinements mostly kept to towns and better shops. They also doubt how widely pure beeswax was cut into household mixes to tame smell or droop, given cost and the habit of thrift. You have your answer for today, which is the answer most days. Keep the blend honest, keep the room steady, and let the trial flame tell the truth in fewer words than a book. By now, the pool has taught you its temper, and you answer with the quiet confidence of repetition. Rod after rod learns the new weight. Molds accept their share. Trial wicks whisper that the work will not scold you later. The air has the mild sweetness of wax, and the clean animal plainness of tallow, crossed by the iron's slow breathing. The door admits a very small draft, and then changes its mind. You finish one circuit, then another, then stand still long enough to hear your own sleeves settling. The kettle drops back to a doze. You pour the last safe measures into a loaf pan so tomorrow will begin as sensibly as today. The surface levels and takes on that familiar faint skin that means the fat has decided to be quiet. You wipe the rim, rinse the spoon, and set them where they will not learn dust. Blending ends the way so many good tasks do. Not with a flourish, but with nothing left to do badly. You pull the little sled from under the bed frame, where it sleeps between errands, its runners nicked from winters that did not ask permission. It weighs almost nothing by itself, only the idea of work in wooden form. Snow powdered into the grain turns your palm cool and leaves a bright line across your glove. The rope handle is plated and rough. You give it the old test, a steady lean and a small lift, and it replies that it remembers how to be pulled without sulks. Straw waits in a sack by the door, dry and talkative. You shake a first armful onto the sled bed, letting it fall in a high, forgiving layer. It whispers when you press it flat, then rustles back when you release your hand, as if trying to stand a little taller for the job. You make 2 shallow nests with the edge of your palm, one for the heavy crate, one for the lighter box of church tapers, and cross a few stalks at the corners, so the load will learn good manners at once. Next comes the crate, the stout one with the leather straps and the lid that understands responsibility. You lift with knees and patience, lower it into the first nest, and hear the sled accept it with a small wooden note that sounds like assent. The lighter box follows, tucked so it will not inch sideways when the lane shows you its ruts. A folded cloth slips between the two, because peace begins at the border. You test the balance with a cautious tilt to left and right. The sled answers by staying itself, which you reward with silence. Rope does the rest. You lace a long line across the crate, pass it through the sled's side staves, and bring it back to tie a square knot that would hold an honest argument. The tail tucks under its own belly. A shorter thong goes around the taper box, then forward to a wooden cleat you screwed in last winter when you needed something to blame for a near mishap. You check each line with your knuckles. Knuckles know which work will fail and which will mind its duty. Runners always want attention, so you indulge them. A scrap of cloth and a breath-warm dab of tallow, drawn thin along each runner's length, barely a whisper, only enough to teach the grain to slide. You rub until the faint sheen loses its pride and keeps only usefulness. The sled lifts and sets with a better sound now, a smaller argument with the floorboards. You nod to it the way you nod to facts, quickly, without ornament. You add the small necessities that make markets tolerable. The cloth to wipe frost, the stub of pencil with a knife that will sharpen it, 1 spare band of paper, a coil of twine, 2 squares of linen for wrapping a single taper when a person wants only the one, and the tin plate for demonstrating that a wick can be trusted. The trimmer slides into its pouch, the snuffer too. A tiny shovel hangs from the back crosspiece, more dignity than tool, but Snow respects a gesture. Clothing is also a tool. You take the shawl that knows your shoulders and wind it once, then again, until the air near your neck stops searching for shortcuts. The cap learns its job. The mittens, warmed earlier, arrive like obedient dogs. Boots accept their thongs with the patience of leather that will never be young again. You drop a small coin purse into your coat pocket, not because you expect coins to sing there, but because customers are happier when change falls out of nowhere. The door becomes a partner when you ask it politely. You lift the latch. Iron speaks its usual sentence. A flat blue of river cold leans in and inspects the room, then approves without saying so. You pull the sled to the threshold and stop there, because the first motion outside matters. Runners find the snow's crust. The straw settles. The leather gives one creak. You step forward, and the sled follows as if the two of you rehearsed. The lane admits you to its arithmetic-packed snow, a scatter of grit at the corners, ruts that pretend to be rails until they choose to be traps. You choose the crown of the track when you can, the shoulder when you must, and a neighbor's swept ribbon of path when kindness has already been done for you. The rope leans into your palm, and your arm answers with that useful ache that has nothing to do with complaint. Breaths rise like the smallest of prayers and vanish. A bell sounds from farther up, then another. The short talk of a horse that expects the world to make way. You step aside before you are asked. Take the sled's tail with one hand and the prow with the other, and let the sleigh pass in its glitter of harness and steam. The driver touches two fingers to his cap. You return the courtesy as if you owned a larger vehicle than you do. When the wake of the sleigh's runners has finished rearranging the snow, you start again, and the sled says it has forgotten the interruption already. You pause once to check the lines and the corners. The crate has settled deeper into its bed, which pleases you. Settling is what anyone should do when travel begins. You pull a little more straw up under the box's edge and press it firm. The taper box wants to tip if you let it dream about tipping. You deny it dreams by crossing the thong once more. A hand along each runner finds no new splinters. The road's news is dull, which is your favorite kind. You remember, because you are allowed to remember, other winters when men pulled larger loads and called them ordinary. Sled roads across this province learn to appear as soon as frost becomes fact. Packed by feet and hooves, guided by fences and riverbanks, cared for nobody in particular and everybody at once. You practice their quiet grammar, and it rewards you by carrying light where light needs to go, without bothering to name the service. At the end of the lane, the town yawns awake at the edges, shudders thinking about moving, smoke stepping more confidently from chimneys, a figure or two walking like people who know where they intend to arrive. Your sled clicks a small stone, then remembers itself, and you accept that as a sign that this will be a day like other days. Your breath sits mild in your scarf. Your hands inside your mittens are still your hands. The rope does not saw at your palm. This is how errands should begin. You stop at the first doorway that knows your name before you speak it. The yard is swept in two dark paths where boots have made their argument with the snow, and won by repetition. Icicles hang from the eave like glassy candles. You lift the latch with a mittened hand and rap once with the knuckles that wear the work of your week. Inside there is the shuffle of a chair, and a voice that means to be brisk and lands on kind instead. You step into steam and flour dust. The neighbor's kitchen smells of bread already decided to be bread, and of yesterday's pan telling an honest story. A boy you have known since he was mostly elbows offers you a jar in both hands. The lid keeps its place by stubbornness and string. Your mitten finds the fold. The lid gives up with a tired sigh, and the smell inside is exactly what you expected. You set the jar on the table and test its weight by pretending you are not testing it. The neighbor watches, though she pretends to rearrange plates. The ceremony is older than the lane and simpler than a ledger. She saves what she can. You turn it into light. She pays partly in coin and partly in drippings. Both of you leave thinking you got the better bargain. You keep the ceremony dignified by saying very little. You untie the string that keeps a circle of waxed cloth to the jar's mouth and press the cloth flat to see how clean the keeping was. A few crumbs nod up at you, not enough to scold. You tip the contents, and a soft pale hill slides into your pan. A spoon lifts a corner. It is willing. You praise it by not praising it. She asks what a dozen will cost if she brings another jar by week's end. You name the price that is fair on cold days and charity on feast eves. She nods and reaches for the little purse that knows the sound of small coins. 2 go on the table copper that has kept company with flour and lint. You put them in your pocket as if pockets were meant for such satisfactions. The boy studies the crate as if it might tell him a story. You open the lid and let him look at the bundles bound with paper. He asks if candles are made in pairs because light needs a friend. You tell him yes, because some technical truths are better as friendly lies. He smiles the way a lantern does when glass is clean. You hand him a single 6 to warm near the stove while you write the figures in your head. You take the stub of pencil from your pocket and mark a slate by the door that is not yours, but believes you will behave. 1 jar credit, 1 dozen promised. A small mark beside the price because you will take back a little of it in the next jar. She nods without looking. That is another ceremony. A household that keeps its accounts in a head and on a door needs no clerk but habit. You hold 1 stout draught candle near the doorway and open it a little to see whether the hall makes mischief. The flame leans and then minds itself. She looks relieved in the way people do when something ordinary promises to be reliable. You trim the crown with your little shears and leave the trimmings on your plate. The house tests the light and approves. You tie her dozen with twine because she trusts knots more than paper. The twine bites your glove and remembers to behave. You set the bundle on the shelf near the door where a draft will not teach it bad habits. The jar you wrap in the waxed cloth and bind again, this time with a firmness that tells it to keep faith until you can melt it into obedience. Your mitten leaves a small grease star on the cloth. The cloth forgives you. She brings out a surprise 2 narrow tapers saved from last year's feast. Stubs not long enough to pretend they are anything but stubs. She sets them on the table with an expression that hopes you will not be insulted by her thrift. You are not. You say you will take them in with the week's scrap and let them become part of something that minds its manners. She seems to grow lighter by the amount of 2 stubs. You put them with your plate and make a note to yourself you will not write. Before you leave, you do the quiet, good turn that costs nothing. You take one of the kitchen 6s from your sample shelf, light it, and set it in a tin saucer on her table while she ties a child's scarf. The room looks suddenly tidier for no new labor. She sees it and says nothing, because thanks feels too large for the price of a wick. You snuff it with wetted fingers and leave the candle by the stove to dry its feelings. Back in the yard, the cold has kept your sled honest. The runners give that small winter hymn when you shift your weight. You fit the jar under the crate's strap where it can learn patience, tighten the knot by 1 thought, and lay a handful of straw over it, as though tucking in a child who refuses to admit to sleep. The boy waves from the doorway. You answer with your rope hand and begin to move, careful of the first rut that always waits where the yard pretends to end. At the lane's bend, you count the trade the way a person counts steps to the next corner. 1 jar, 2 coins, 1 promise, 2 stubs that will not be stubs for long. It is not a fortune. It is a piece of the day that allows the rest of the day to continue. Your hands agree with the rope. The crate rests in its nest. The church tapers keep their quiet perfume under cloth. The town waits as towns do, already itself, and yet willing to notice you when you arrive. You pull on, and the sled follows as if the 2 of you are one person who remembered to bring their shadow. You take the long way past the river, because the path is even there. The wind cleaner and the bell tower keeps time in a language your boots understand. The sled hums along the packed edge where feet and hooves have rubbed winter into a smooth idea. Up ahead, the parish house leans into its own shadow, boards dark with the breath of many cold seasons. The church beside it holds still, tall and pale, with a roof that wears snow like a calm hat. You feel the pull in the rope hand and the comfort that comes when work knows where it is going. The clerk keeps an office that smells of ink and wool. He opens the door with his cautious face, and then remembers you are not a petition and becomes human by degrees. His hands are red with the weather and with the work of pencils that have been sharpened by knives. He greets your sled with the same nod he uses for the holy days written in his book, Recognition Without Surprise. You pull the crate inside to the corner that understands straw and leather and people who count. He has his list, of course. He always has his list. It is a column of dates and numbers, wearing small letters that march in straight lines. Candlemas, a procession, the feast of a certain saint who never seems to mind winter. He touches the page as if it could bruise. You unstrap the lighter box first, the one with the beeswax tapers that remember summer. The cloth holds their quiet fragrance against the cold until now. when the room opens its nose and admits that honey has a way of saying things ink cannot. He clears a square of table and sets out a piece of twine cut long ago to the length that means altar height. He measures by laying the twine along the tapers, end to end, and nodding to himself. When both agree that nothing has grown shorter since last year, he counts by twos and then by 12s, lips moving with the care of a man who has been corrected in front of candles before and prefers never to be corrected again. You stand with your mittens under your arm and let his numbers become the day's weather. 2 dozen for Candlemas, he says, touching a line, 1 dozen stout for the nave, another line, and a short half-dozen for the sacristy, to be trimmed as needed. He looks at you as if asking whether the winter will behave. You give him the face you give anyone who asks you to guarantee a season. He smiles because he knows better and writes all the same. The box on the table answers each requirement with orderly bundles that lie like well-behaved geese. He tests the feet of a few, standing them on the board to see who wobbles. None do. He plucks the crown of a taper between forefinger and thumb, as if it were a nettle that has been promised good manners. The wick stands at the precise immodesty you allow at delivery. He approves with a soft sound in his throat that is not quite a word. The sound is worth more than his ink, though the ink will be how he remembers to pay you later. From a drawer he brings out 2 stubs, beeswax still sweet but shortened, to the length where pride and usefulness stop speaking. He lays them on the table with that look every clerk learns, a hope that thrift will not be mistaken for stinginess. You accept the stubs as you always do, with the same care you give to coins, because old light is still light when asked politely. You wrap them in a scrap of cloth and tuck them away for the evening melt, where they will forget they were ever small. He asks about drafts in the nave, as if drafts are parishioners. You say the door up front insists on being a door, and he sighs as if that is a failing rather than a duty. You suggest the stout tapers for the aisle lamps and the taller, leaner ones nearer the altar where the air sits like a well-behaved choir. He writes this advice in the margin, though both of you know he will place them by memory on the morning of the feast, and then pretend the notes guided him. You have no objection to a margin taking credit for experience. Payment is a ceremony. He counts out coin from a small bag that keeps a clean rattle, a few silvers, a handful of coppers, then places a slip on the table for what will be owed when Lent grows nearer, and the parish remembers it is richer in obligations than in money. You carry both, the coin heavier than it looks, the paper lighter than it should be. You put them in your purse in the order he hands them, because order pleases him, and you are here to please as long as no candle has to suffer for it. Before you close the box, he asks for a demonstration, for the same reason he always asks, the satisfaction of seeing quiet things do their work. You oblige. The tin plate comes from your bag. A single taper stands. The snuffer sits near enough to calm the pious in him. You light the wick and let the flame find its voice. The clerk holds his breath as if a single exhale could undo centuries of habit. The taper bows, steadies, and holds so still you can hear the page settle back against the table as his hand relaxes. He smiles the smile of a man who has avoided a complaint he would have had to write in a careful hand. He asks after your health, because that is customary. You answer in the grammar of weather and wax. Steady, enough to do, enough to sell, enough to sleep. He nods and speaks of a parishioner who remembers your father's lengths and swears that tapers were taller then. You answer without answering, which is how one survives both memory and parishioners. He laughs into his scarf and admits that people rarely remember light correctly. They only remember how it made them feel. You both agree that this is not a bad fault. The sacristy door stands half open, and for a minute the two of you carry the box into that hush where vestments hang like disciplined flags, and the air is cleaner than the air in town. You set the bundles on a shelf that has been told it is important, and it believes it. The clerk arranges them in a row in the order his list prefers. Feast, Sunday, ordinary days. He adjusts a label by the thickness of a fingernail and steps back like a gardener who trusts a bed now that the weeds are removed. When you return to the office, he ties the box with a plain cord you provided. He writes your name in his book with his careful, cranky script and adds a small mark that means reliable in a dialect only he speaks. He warms his hands against his own candle stub and thanks you in 2 short syllables that would be brusque if they were not so sincere. You answer with a nod heavy enough to carry winter, and that seems to satisfy both of you. Outside, the tower looks taller because you have been indoors. The sled feels lighter because boxes that belonged here now belong here. The rope falls into your palm and behaves. You pause long enough to feel the cold decide what to do with your cheeks, then turn toward the market because you still have common dozens to sell to people who like their light plain and their arguments short. Behind you, the clerk closes his door with a sound like a page turning, which is, for him, a kind of blessing. You reach the square as if it were another room in your house, one with more roofs and more opinions. The stalls remember where to stand. The snow remembers where to lie. A pale sun balances on the church roof and pretends to be warmer than it is. You pull the sled to your accustomed place, along the lee of a shed wall, where the wind spends itself before it reaches you. The boards underfoot have seen salt and hooves and the winter's short tempers. They decide to be level enough for your purposes. You set the crate down and let the rope relax. Your breath pushes a small cloud away, and it does not bother to return. The neighbors arrive in their own slow order. A woman with eggs and a face that tells you how many did not make it through the cold. A man with root vegetables and a sack that gives him the posture of a man who does not argue with weight. A fishmonger whose boots speak louder than his mouth. The market is awake without fuss. You lift the lid, as if telling someone a story begins. Straw rustles like good manners. Bundles come out and line themselves without asking for a parade. You place the stout 6s first plain, reliable, the kind that forgive drafts and forget slights. Next, the 8s for sewing and reading, the modest candles that make books possible when daylight gets bored too early. Beeswax stays near the back in its own neat square, not to hide it, only to keep it from arguing with the tallow by perfume. You space the rows with the width of your hand, so buyers can see what they are buying without moving anything that would prefer to stay where you put it. A board in front receives your chalk. You write small, 6s by the dozen, and the price beneath, 8s by the dozen. Stout draft, tapers. Your hand keeps its calm, square letters. You do not draw flourishes. Chalk is for facts, not for songs. A stray snowflake lands in the loop of an O and sits there like punctuation that knows its place. You brush away a dusting of frost from the bench. The wood underneath seems relieved to be wood again. You test the display from a customer's height. The bundles read clearly. The twine tails point inward. The paper bands show figures without needing to be coaxed. A single sample candle stands in a pewter plate, trimmed and ready, because some people believe nothing until it stands quietly in front of them and behaves. The trimmer lies beside the plate, its small box ready to hold the crown of ash when the time comes. You greet the egg woman with a modest nod and receive one in return that says she has counted her eggs and counted your chalk and approves of both. The root man arranges his turnips into ranks as if they were soldiers and sniffs at your beeswax in a way that means it is welcome. The fishmonger sets down a tub that believes the world should know what is in it. You steer your attention to your own goods and your own air. The market is a place where everyone pretends not to hear everyone else's business and succeeds half the time. You pull on your mittens and wait without a posture of waiting. Waiting is a skill that looks like idleness to the untrained. A woman with a shawl the color of a storm cloud stops, reads, and looks at your bundles as if they might explain something about her evening. You offer the smallest sentence, burns steady. Little trimming if you keep the wick honest. She nods because trimming wicks reminds her of trimming hems. She chooses 8s with the decisiveness of someone who has already seen the room where they will live. The first coin of the morning feels heavier than it should and lighter than you expected. You make change with the quiet confidence of a person who has counted far worse things. The coin goes into your purse. The paper band goes into her basket. The market accepts this transaction as part of its grammar and continues its sentence without a comma. You lay a log of straw on the bench edge, where cold tries to creep into your hands. It acts as a small barrier and a small reminder. Straw keeps goods from catching the market's habit of bruising. A draft noses along the wall. Your sample flame leans and then resolves itself. You trim with one neat bite, and the ash drops exactly where it should. A passerby who is not going to stop now stops because the simple act of a crown falling into a box is sometimes more persuasive than chalk. A child's mittened hand appears at the edge of the table and hovers over the beeswax as if scent were a kind of warmth. You let that brief hovering happen, then lift a taper and roll it a quarter turn so the seam shows as a faint truth. Honest, you say, and the mother behind the mitten relaxes by one worry. She buys a pair for Sunday and tucks them between folded cloths as if they were polite geese. Between customers you tend the rows the way a gardener tends a bed. He knows will survive him. Straighten a band, dust a rim of frost, nudge a bundle half an inch, so the next hand will find it without thinking. A man asks whether your stout draft will stand in a doorway that hates poetry. You tell him it will stand in a doorway that hates most things. He grins as if a poem has already been defeated. He buys 2 dozen, and it is not your fault if he feels he has won. The clock in the tower does not ring a number. It clears its throat. You eat a corner of bread without removing your mittens, and drink from a small tin mug that has kept something warm enough to be called tea. The steam lifts into the light and decides it is a good day to be steam. Your sled stands at your back like a patient dog. You touch its rope with your elbow, and it accepts this as praise. The market changes in small ways. Boots make new lines. The fishmonger announces less. The egg woman counts without showing her lips. The root man hides a good turnip for someone who is late. You hold a dozen up to a pale stripe of sun and check for any shadow within the wax. It is clear enough to please you, and not so clear it forgets it is tallow. A man who looks like he argues for a living buys a single pair and tells you he prefers light that does not talk back. You give him the kind that listens. You notice when your display begins to look thinner, not because you counted, but because the table looks less crowded. You rearrange so emptiness does not pretend to be failure. The chalk prices stay where they are, short and sufficient. A woman asks whether the eights will stain a white tablecloth. You tell her not if she minds the wick. She approves of advice that asks her to be tidy. It is the kind she already knows how to follow. Snow begins to change its mind about falling, and then changes it back. You tie a scarf tighter and breathe into it as if it were a small stove. The beeswax corner keeps its soft field smell even here. A man from the inn arrives with a list that did not start as a list but became one because mornings bully intentions into writing. You find his mark on a bundle, and he gives you a coin that has seen better pockets. The ledger in your head keeps pace. The tower finally tells the hour, and the sound runs along the roofs like a hand. You look at what remains and decide there is enough to stay and enough to leave. The market continues whether you are here or not. Your part of it sits in rows that make sense and go where they are pointed. You straighten the last band that needed straightening and let your hands rest on the edge of the table. The day will spend itself sensibly if you let it. People come the way light does in winter late, careful and grateful when they arrive. A farmer with a cap pulled low studies the chalk, then studies the bundles as if numbers might change their minds if he waits them out. You let the waiting be. He asks how long a 6 will last if his wife reads a chapter each night. You answer in evenings, not in hours. You hold a single 6 between finger and thumb, the way a person holds a promise. You tell him that if the wick minds itself and the room keeps its drafts on a leash, a 6 burns through a quiet supper, dishes, a psalm or two, and the beginning of sleep. He nods, translating your answer into the grammar of his table. He buys 2 dozen and looks as if his week just agreed to behave. Next is a seamstress with a tape peeking from her pocket like a tame snake. She wants light that does not lean towards smoke when she bends close to find a stitch in gray cloth. You place an 8 in her hand. You say, trim, as soon as the crown thinks it is clever. Keep the flame no taller than your little fingernail. She smiles, because her hands already know the lesson. She chooses the dozen that looks like patience. 2 men who argue for sport ask whether thick candles save money or only pride. You show a stout pair and a modest pair, stand them in the plate, and set them to burning with the fairness you would show to brothers. The stout speaks louder, the modest lower, but both hold to the same good manners. You tell the men that the question is not thickness, but where the candle lives, doorway that quarrels, table that behaves. They leave feeling they have won. You let them both be right. A mother with a baby bundled, as if winter required an apology, pauses longer than most. She asks whether tallow stains linen when it is careless. You say that linen forgives quick drips if promptly ignored, and that beeswax is the better guest for christenings and keeping cloths. She chooses 2 beeswax tapers and 4 eights, and pays with coins warmed by the same pocket that warms the child's hand. You put a little square of paper between each pair because kindness, like straw, prevents bruising. An older man in a coat repaired by 3 different people wants 1 candle only, something he can place in a window while a daughter walks back from the mill after dusk. He counts his coins with the shyness of someone counting difficulties instead. You wrap a stout single as if it were a delicate thing, slip in a spare strip of wick for trimming, and take a coin less than the price without calling attention to your arithmetic. He says nothing, which is the loudest thanks. A boy of about 10 comes with a message from the schoolmaster. The slate says, 1 does 8s, 1 tin of ends for practice. You give him the dozen, and because you remember being 10 and being sent, you add a small paper of stub wicks to be tied and trimmed in the afternoon. The kind of busy work that warms a room without heating it. He pockets the extra with the careful gravity of someone who knows his errands are measured. The wind thinks about being a nuisance and decides on restraint. Your sample flame leans and rights itself like a disciplined sailor. A woman you recognize by her basket's habit of carrying yarn asks about brine on the wick. She has heard it keeps smoke shy. You say that good trimming and a steady room do more than salt's opinion. She laughs into her scarf and buys 8s, because people prefer advice they can carry in their hands. A carter wants bundles that do not argue with a barn. You show him the stout draft and let him see the base stand without wavering when the bench receives a tap. He orders by pointing, not by numbers, and you count for him. He offers to trade a ride home if your crate grows heavy. You answer that a person who sells light learns to accept rides the way he accepts weather, when offered, without debate. Coins gather in your purse in a tone you recognize enough weight to prove the morning, not enough to make the day proud. Between sales you straighten the rows and press a loosened band back to duty. The chalice of beeswax scent rises and fades, never insisting. From time to time you take up the trimmer and let its quiet click persuade the sample flame to keep its manners. People like to see obedience before they buy hope. A young couple walks slowly along the bench, fingers almost touching, eyes busy with the arithmetic of starting out together. They talk about how many evenings a dozen might hold, and whether 1 candle at the table is cheer or stinginess. You say a single light teaches conversation, 2 invite reading, 3 insist on company. They buy 2 dozen, 1 stout, 1 8. You tie the bands snug and wish them a winter that tells the truth gently. Near noon, an argument from the far end of the square tries to become a spectacle. Boots shift toward it. Heads remember curiosity. You keep your stall still. Markets test whether you will look away from your own goods. You pass the test by brushing a little frost from the bench and offering a small nod to the next customer, as if nothing louder than light exists. The argument finds it cannot lift your chalk and loses interest in you. A man with ink on his cuff wants prices to the pound, not to the dozen, because he prefers his arithmetic to yours. You tell him the counts and the weights you keep. The way 6s will come 12 to the pound, 8s more, stout fewer. Beeswax refusing to be bullied by figures. He makes a show of converting. You let him keep his method and take his coin with the same hand you would take anyone's eyes. You pour a little warm water into the tin plate and wash away the crown crumbs and the thin coins of congealed tallow that built themselves while you were speaking. The clean plate looks like a fresh promise. A final customer before you close for the noon bread asks for the kind that does not need reminding. You say there is no such kind, but there are candles that answer quickly to courtesy. He smiles as if you had told him something about himself. He buys a dozen and leaves looking measured rather than satisfied, which is sometimes better. When the sun moves a patient finger along the shed wall, you know it is time to rest your palm and your voice. You pull the sled a handspan nearer to shelter, cover the beeswax with cloth, as if putting a child to nap, and count what is left not by numbers, but by how the table breathes lighter, but still itself. You keep your place in the square by looking as though you never left it, even when you sit on the crate with bread and a quiet cup, even when the market makes its own small weather without you. Customers weigh price against burn hours the way bakers weigh flour by feel first, then by a number, only when the hand insists. A man with careful boots asks if a dozen sixes outlast 2 stout dozens in a long winter. You set a 6 and a stout in your palm and say, "A doorway spends flame faster than a quiet room. A trimmed wick lives longer than a proud one, and thrift and patience together beat thickness alone." He buys a dozen of each and looks satisfied with his arithmetic. A woman with red hands from the pump wants light from mending and for stories after the small ones sleep. She asks for a number. You give the kind that mines truth without prying. A 6 will see a family through supper and a tale of trimmed. An 8 keeps the needle honest an hour more. A stout spares arguments with the door, but eats more of itself to do it. She chooses 8s because stories and mending share a table. 2 mill hands study the chalk and the wind coming down the street. One likes a flame he can forget. The other trusts only what he has to tend. You light one of each on the tin plate. The room does its small experiments. A breath at the door, a passerby shadow. The modest candle keeps its grammar. The stout makes a short speech and settles. The beeswax offers a quieter sentence. They buy what matches their tempers and leave feeling-wise. A schoolmistress with frost on her shawl asks whether a lower price means poorer manners. You tell her thrift and quality often meet if one keeps the wick no taller than the smallest fingernail and snuffs without smoke. You lay 2 6s on their sides and roll them. Roundness tells its own truth. She chooses by touch, not number, and pays with coins, stacked like lessons. Someone asks if buying by the pound is wiser than by the dozen. You set a bundle of 6s on your small scale and let the needle answer. The scale speaks. The customer translates it into suppers and stares and the long habit of winter. When he pays, he counts not just coins, but evenings. He will not spend arguing with darkness. You watch hands as much as faces. A careful hand tests the base on the board. A hurried hand pinches crowns. A doubtful hand reads the seam with a thumb and decides whether a maker has told the truth. You keep your goods honest, so every sort of hand finds nothing clever to discover. When someone asks whether these candles smoke, you say, "Only when mouths are careless and rooms impatient." Then you trim the sample with one neat bite, and the question answers itself. Coins and questions arrive together like snow on roofs. A woman pays in 2 kinds of money and 1 kind of thanks. A carter gives you a larger coin and refuses the change because last month's bundle lasted longer than his temper. A lad returns a stub and asks for a penny's credit. You accept and tell him to bring 2 next time for the pleasure of making a dozen whole again. The market approves this arithmetic by continuing to exist. Near noon, you look along the bench to see what the morning has kept and what it has given away. The beeswax corner thins without fuss. The stout row shows 2 tidy gaps. The 8s are a diminishing hedge. You reorder with the calm of a person who distrusts drama, lifting bundles forward, turning bands so the pencil speaks plainly, brushing away frost crumbs that try to look like failure. A fisherman with a river in his coat wonders whether tallow will carry yesterday's smell into today's soup. You say no if the wick is minded and the drafts are polite. Yes if a window refuses its manners. He nods, as if teaching windows were a task he has attempted. He buys 6s and a trimmer, which he calls a little jaw, and you do not correct him because the name suits the tool. A widow with a firm mouth asks for the cheapest dozen, and then stands looking at the beeswax as if it has accused her of something. You place a single taper in her hand without speaking. She breathes, and the honey quiet of it feels like permission. She buys only the cheap dozen, as she said, but her hand lingers on the taper as if it might follow her home despite the arithmetic. Accounts and comforts have their private negotiations. You field the practical, which is most of it. How often to trim? As soon as the crown forgets humility. How to carry a light in wind. Shield without smothering. Keep the flame lower than pride. How to save a tunneled candle. Open a side door with a pin. Pour away the pool. Trim, relight, and pretend it never happened. People nod, grateful that ordinary troubles have simple cures. By the time the bread is gone, so is any doubt about returning tomorrow. The crate is lighter. Your purse has found its proper weight. The bench looks like a task half done, which is the right look for a market before noon. You rest your hands on the table, feeling the dull kindness of wood that has learned to support many trades. The wind softens by a breath. Somewhere, a sleigh chimes its small conclusion and vanishes into the day. You do not boast about burn hours or miracles. You sell the idea that a steady light is the same as a steady mood, not thrilling but faithful, not loud but present, the sort of thing that once owned becomes invisible and indispensable. Customers leave with bundles that look unremarkable and feel like solved problems. You are content to be the person who made those problems smaller, priced in twine and chalk instead of pride. When a lull arrives, you wipe the plate clean, trim the sample to its good short tongue, and draw the cloth over the beeswax for a little while. You look at the square and see it for what it is: a congregation of small needs answered by ordinary skills. You stand in your proper place among them, a seller of quiet hours, and think without smiling that business is as it should be. The inn smells of boiled coffee and of doorways that have taught wind to speak. You draw the sled to the side entrance because the step there is sensible and the traffic behaves like a tide. The innkeeper meets you with his apron folded, as if it were also a list. He taps a knuckle on your crate, as if checking the ripeness of light. You show him the stout bundles first, the kind that stand upright in a draft, and do not write soot on beam or joke. He sets one on the counter, and presses the foot flat on the wood, turning it as if it were a wheel that should not wobble. It does not. You place a second beside it, and his face relaxes by a thumb's width. He asks for door, bar, stair, and stable, naming rooms the way a man tames them before evening. He wants a test, because he always wants a test. You set the tin plate near the lee of the hearth where the air has finished arguing and will now listen. A stout learns flame, steadies, and throws a plain bowl of light across the boards. You open the side door a finger's width. The draft lifts its shoulders. The flame leans, corrects, and resumes. The trimmer takes the little cap. The light thanks you by growing quiet. Orders have their arithmetic. For the door, 2 dozen stout, trimmed close. For the bar, 8s that do not swagger. For the stair, modest 6s set in niches, 1 at each landing. For the stable, thick ends that forgive hay and a horse's opinions. You mark paper bands the way you and he have done since last thaw. He brings a slate and copies your marks into his marks. The world does not object. Payment walks here in 2 shoes, coin now, credit after market day. He counts silvers for what leaves the counter and names the rest for Saturday, which you accept because he has never taught a promise to stray. In the same gesture, he puts on the bar a jar with a linen lid the week saved drippings. You tuck it beneath the sled strap where a nest of straw waits to be kind. He asks about lantern cups, the tin saucers you bring when wind forgets its manners. You set 2 on the counter, show the rolled lip that catches a drip, and the ring for carrying. He takes both, then adds 3 more, because the rooms upstairs never agree about weather. His pencil makes small noises. Your purse replies with small weight. Before you go, he wants the sample light set on the bar to remind the room to behave. You light a stout, trim it almost at once, and watch the flame lower its pride. Men at the bar make room for it as for a guest who speaks softly. You leave the trimmer within reach and tell the barkeep to use it without ceremony. He nods as if he has been waiting for permission to be careful. Back outside, the sled understands the new weight. The door closes, with the sound of work continuing. The innkeeper's list folds into his pocket. Your chalk marks fold into memory. You step into the street, where the day lifts its shoulder at the wind and decides to keep going. You carry bundles to his storeroom where shelves keep bottles and histories. A square of straw is a bed for stout dozens. You chalk a mark on the crate's lid so you remember his count when the week turns. Back in the square, the river sends you a customer before you can rearrange the bench. He wears a cap with weather sewn into the seam and a coat that remembers pine and tar. He smells of smoke and of cold. The word voyageur walks ahead of him. He nods at your bundles. He does not ask prices. He asks what will burn true in a camp where a draft is host. You place a stout on the plate. Light, trim. Open your palm behind it to lend it a wind it did not ask for, and show the flame lean, recover, and hold. He nods once, the nod of someone who prefers proofs to promises. He buys by gesture. not number. 2 dozen stout, a dozen eights, a handful of ends to start fires when rain visits. He pays with coin rubbed by iron and river stones, and with a story told while your hands tie the bands. The story belongs to a bend-up river where ice pretended to be water, a canoe listened poorly, and a lantern chased a wave before thinking better of it. You listen as you measure twine. The tale ends with the lantern saved and knots improved. You set aside a pair for the first night ashore, and he does not argue. He asks for 1 taper of beeswax, for the saint who minds fools on water, and you pass it without naming which saint. He breathes the scent the way men drink after long work, and wraps it in a rag with a tenderness that belongs to better rooms. He asks if he can trade a little fat later when the river is kind. You answer that light accepts such charity. He tests a stout at arm's length, as if deciding whether it will hold a tense temper. The crown behaves, the pool sits where it should. He flicks a look at the sky, at the rope in your hand, at your chalk. He says he will be back before thaw, if the river allows. The river is always allowed. You tell him you will be here if the square allows, which it usually does. He tucks the bundles into a sack that has carried everything a person might need. He slips 2 sixes into his coat pocket, where warmth will remind them to be kind on first lighting. He returns 1 coin, balancing the bargain with story as well as silver. You accept it. Custom is older than your bench. Before he goes, he asks how high you keep a wick in wind. You show the measure shorter than pride, taller than stinginess, by pinching air above the flame. He grins and says the river trims everything to that length sooner or later. He steps away with the walk of a man shaped by weather, who expects weather to keep its word most of the time. When he reaches the far side of the square, he turns and lifts 2 fingers. You answer the same way. The gesture sets down between you like a small anchor. Then he has gone into the day. Like a map he already knows how to fold. The plate on your bench still holds a tongue of light. You trim it and think that some customers pay in coin, and some in proof the world remains navigable when a person does not rush. You watch the rope marks on his palms as he ties the sack, neat and fast. They look like little maps of channels and shoals. Your goods will learn those lines tonight, trading benches and rafters for canvas, frost, and a patient current. Noon arrives by degrees, the way a kettle decides to speak. The sun climbs the shed wall a hand's breadth and pauses there. The square keeps moving, but forgets to hurry. You take your bread from the crate, unwrap the cloth, and let the steam that is not steam anymore remember the room. Cheese follows, simple and willing. A tin cup receives water warmed on the stove. You sit on the crate with your back to the wall that understands both wind and shoulders. The sled rests like a dog that knows its work, has been noticed. You eat with mittened fingers because the air asks for that courtesy. Bread, then cheese, then a swallow, and the order feels like a small law you are happy to obey. A crumb invites a sparrow to consider you. The sparrow decides you are harmless and becomes a customer of crumbs. You look over the table without standing. Bundles sit as if they grew there. Paper bands read clearly, twine ends are behaved, a few gaps have become invitations rather than wounds. You rotate 1 dozen so the pencil will meet the next person's eye without asking for attention. The sample candle keeps its modest tongue. You trim it with a tidy bite and the ash falls in the right place. The plate is a mirror. Across the square, the fishmonger lowers his voice. The egg woman counts shells only she can see. The root man rests 1 foot and then the other, as if negotiating a treaty with weight. A bell from the tower remarks upon the hour and then loses interest. A cart passes and ignores you politely. The day sits without starting conversations it cannot finish. You break the bread's heel and keep it for later. The heel forgives you. You finish the cup and hold the metal to your lip a moment longer than necessary, because the warmth knows how to speak to winter. Your hands feel like your hands again. You wipe the knife on the cloth and slip both away. Not because anyone is watching, but because order is a habit that makes the next habit easier. A woman looking for buttons stops and asks if the beeswax are as steady as the clerk says they are. You answer only as much as she requires, which is not much. Steady enough for prayer, quiet enough for reading, and willing to mind their own pool. She buys 2 and tucks them into a pocket sewn for exactly that purpose. She leaves the way she arrived, without fuss. The sparrow approves by discovering another crumb. You check the sled strap and add a handful of straw to the jar of drippings, so it will not think about moving. You retie the cloth over the beeswax, because the scent has tried to become a conversation, and conversations cost stock. The chalkboard still tells truths in a small hand. You brush one corner clean and write the word ends, because the box beneath the table has collected enough to sell honestly by the scoop. You leave the crate long enough to stretch the back that has agreed to be cooperative. The sky praises itself with a brightness that does not change the temperature. You stand there and do nothing in a way that looks like doing something, which is the art of markets. Then you sit again, fold the empty cloth, and put the cup away. The noon part of the day has ended with the proper silence. You are ready for the afternoon to try its luck. Afternoon tilts the square like a book left by a drowsing reader. You stand, roll your shoulders, and let blood return to your fingers. A pale plank of sun crosses your bench. You slide the bundles a thumb's width back so glare won't pretend to be sparkle. The air at your plate is the same patient cold. Still, a tinsmith in a patched hat brings a lantern body that has lost its glass. He wants cups for candles that travel in weather. You show tin saucers with rolled lips and finger rings, plain as a good rule. He decides and buys 4, paying with coin and a promise to true a dent in one of your molds when his fire is kind. You accept. Favors keep longer than small money. 2 girls in slate shawls bring a calico-wrapped box of ends. Do scraps become real candles, or only wish to? Scraps, you say, are honest beginnings. Their bundle rattles into your tin of later. They leave with a dozen 6s tied looser than usual so small hands won't quarrel with twine, plus a slim paper of spare wicks. Wind comes down the lane and remembers to behave at the shed wall. Your sample flame bows, then stands. You trim it. The crown falls like a black petal into the trimmer's jaw. A passerby notices that obedience and buys a dozen to reward it. A seamster, he refuses any other word, complains that last week's 8s burned too willingly near a window that won't close. You hand him a stout and say it is a cousin that eats more but argues less. He laughs, trades 3 coins, and goes away looking as if his work might be easier. The crate's false bottom holds a paper for accounts owed. 2 names crossed, 1 not. The uncrossed name appears. He sets a jar of drippings on the bench like a peace offering. You open it, test for honesty, and say the account and the jar together equal settled. He leaves lighter by worry, if not by coin. Some afternoons need repair more than sales. A woman brings a tunneled candle that has eaten itself into a sulk. You take the pin, open a neat door, pour away the pool, trim the wick to a humbler length, and relight. The flame behaves as if newly taught. She nods with the grave gratitude that belongs to small salvations, and asks for another dozen. You tuck the beeswax under cloth and wait a corner with your knife so fragrance stops volunteering. A boy from the clerk's house chases his hat. The hat wins until you hook it with your stick. His thanks huffs like a small bellows. When custom thins, you do chores that pretend to be rest. Bands straightened, chalk freshened, straw brushed from the bench into the crate where it can be useful twice. The afternoon leans, roofs take a browner light. A final customer arrives with the look of someone sent. A dozen that forgive drafts, she says. You hand her stout, trim the sample in demonstration, and say, keep it short, keep it steady. She repeats the words, counts coin, and goes before the weather changes its mind. You rest both hands on the bench. The square answers by being itself. You gather bundles that want to go home with you and leave the rest in their new owner's arms. Light travels best as promise in afternoon, and as flame in evening. You will spend the next hours moving it from one to the other, with a patience that does not mind being useful. You pack the bench into order the way a person folds a map they intend to use again. Bundles withdraw into straw. Chalk returns to its tin. The plate dries. You hitch the rope, lean, and let the sled accept your decision. Afternoon light lies long and blue. River breath keeps its voice low. You turn toward the convent first, because quiet houses prefer to be visited before noise remembers itself. The door opens to your glove without ceremony. A bell inside gives the smallest note, more permission than greeting. A sister with sleeves rolled for work meets you at the entry. She carries the clean scent of lye and linen, and the calm where clocks obey prayers. You nod. She nods. and the two of you move through a corridor that understands unhurried steps. In the workroom, bread cools under cloth, and spools wait in sober rows. Your bundles go to the cupboard where last year's labels still sit. You untie a dozen beeswax tapers, standing them so the room can learn their height. The sister watches with an accountant's eye and a gardener's patience. She counts without touching. You show the trimmer's neat bite, snuff a crown with wetted fingers, and let the taper resume its serenity. For Vespers, she says, and marks a page with a ribbon the color of wheat. A small basket appears, stubs saved since Advent, wrapped in paper with sizes penciled at the corners. You accept them as if receiving news folded tidy. Payment here is precise and modest. Coin arrives in a linen purse, tied so cleverly that untying feels like an honor. You do not look into the bag. You weigh it, and the sister reads your nod. She offers a jar of honey from the hives in their sheltered yard. You refuse twice, accept once, and promise to trade candles for wax come spring. You leave with the feeling of a page turned carefully. Snow hushes the yard. The sled runs softer, as though straw learned manners from cloistered air. The school stands 2 streets away, windows tall enough to teach daylight how to behave. Children are gone. Chalk ghosts linger on slates. The schoolmaster meets you at the steps with a scarf doing its best. He buys 8s for copy hour and 6s for the hall, counting desks in his head. He asks for a tin of ends, for arithmetic by demonstration, which you understand to mean trimming practice disguised as math. You add 3 stub wicks and say nothing dramatic. He pays in coin. Inside, you place a pair on the desk and light it because rooms forget they are rooms. Lines on the slate steady. The globe stops pretending to spin. You trim once to show where patience begins. The master breathes as if numbers had agreed to stop arguing. A boy returning with wood pauses in the doorway. You hand him the snuffer so he can learn the small authority of endings. He lowers it like a lid on a quiet pot. The candle concedes without smoke. He grins as if given a new verb. You set the pair aside for tomorrow and feel the building's approval settle like dust. Leaving, you note the wind has built a ridge across the lane. You step wide, draw the sled, and listen to runners carve a thought through the drift. Afternoon leans toward quiet bells. One stop at the butcher's yard remains. Then the long pull home, where fat will remember to melt and accounts will add up without scolding anyone for the day they had. The butcher's yard keeps its own calendar: faster mornings, slower afternoons, and a permanent smell of iron learning matters. You swing the gate with your mitten and let it close itself. The snow here is trampled into a map of decisions. Sawdust spreads like pale weather over darker earth. A boy in a stained apron looks up from splitting bones and gives you the shrug that means the pails are where they should be. You find them by the back step, 2 with cloth tied under twine, 1 with a lid that pretends to fit. You lift each by the bale to learn its truth. One tells the good story, solid suet softened in a clean room, no rumors. Another is mixed drippings from pans carried out warm, still willing to be improved. The last is trouble bits of gristle, and a smell that wants to be yesterday forever. The butcher comes from the cutting block with hands that have been washed without pretending to be new. You kneel by the pails and loosen one cloth. The fat beneath is pale as frost and holds a thumbprint without sulking. You nod. He gestures toward the mixed pan. You nod less. He laughs, which is his signature. There is bargaining, but not the theatrical kind. Fat is worth more when saints' days multiply. Less when the river opens and fish begin to shine. You offer coin, jars, and the practice called credit in ends, where you pay a little now and more, with finished dozens next week. He chooses the mixture that suits his own accounts. You take the good pail outright, the mixed on promise, and leave the stubborn third for dogs and opinions. While he weighs the suet on a scale that believes in gravity more than friendship, you inspect the corner where trimmings cool. You ask for the small stuff nobody wanted, the thin comforts that render clear if given time. He fills a cloth with a generosity that looks like housekeeping, ties it with a butcher's knot, and hands it over as if passing a loaf. A cart bumps in from the lane with a wheel that remembers summer mud. A woman trades bones. A lad returns a cleaver. You load your pail into the sled's nest of straw, pushing with your knee until the bale lies flat and the lid forgets its vanity. The mixed pan gets a tighter knot and a place that will not dream of tipping. You stand a moment and breathe through your scarf, because yards like this ask for distance and for gratitude. The butcher counts coins into your mitten with the absent care of a man whose sums are muscle memory. You give him a folded paper for the next dozen he expects. He gives you a string of thanks. Before you go, he asks whether the stout drafts still stand to a barn door that cannot mind itself. You tell him they do if someone minds the wick. He grunts the agreeable grunt and goes back to his block. You pull the sled. The runners take a new line through old tracks, and the yard swings the gate behind you without ceremony. Back on the lane, the pail gives a sensible weight to your rope hand. You plan the evening while Snow takes notes. Strain the good, settle the mixed, boil a kettle, skim and cool. Then teach Wick its next lesson. The day feels shorter with such a list, and kinder. You pass the tannery, decline its story, and head for home where iron remembers fire, and the window remembers to frost. Home receives you with its old, clean breath. The latch lifts, the stove remembers you, and the room looks exactly as you left it, which feels like a favor. You set the sled inside the door just long enough to move the good pail to the hearth, and the mixed to the corner where patience is stored. Straw goes back to its sack, still useful. Rope hangs on its nail, pretending it is not tired. Mittens steam on the chair back. The kettle takes water, and the pail takes a place on 2 bricks. You break the suet into honest pieces and send them across the surface with the spoon that has outlived 3 handles. Fat loosens like ice under a friendly rain. You add a dipper of water because clarity improves when invited, not pursued. Skim rises, you invite it away. While the kettle works, you tend what the square gave. Coins empty into the mug. 2 slips of paper go beneath the stone. A jar of drippings takes its label with the date, and a short word that means whose kitchen supplied it. You coil a little wick, because hands like tasks that do not argue. The trimmer's jaw is brushed clean, pleased to be useful twice in one day. When the suet lies clear, you pour it through linen into a waiting pan, and listen to the ropey sound it makes, like a brook trying to remember a hymn. The cloth is rinsed, wrung, and pinned to the line strung between cupboard and beam. Cracklings go to a dish that will become tomorrow's errand for hens, or a neighbor with opinions about thrift. The clean tallow rests in its pan to think about being tomorrow's work. Now the mixed pan. You warm it only until it remembers it can be poured, then let the sediment settle while you put the room to rights. Molds are upright, rods are stacked, the comb and the knife sit ready. You scrape a small drip at the stove's lip and fold it into the scrap tin. Outside, the street explains itself in occasional sleigh bells. Inside, you set 3 short tests, 1 stout, 1 6, 1 taper, because the day likes to end the way it began, with proof. Each learns flame without complaint. Each holds steady when you open the door and close it again. You snuff them with wetted fingers. Dark arrives politely. Numbers are written last. You sit with the ledger at the table, the chair wearing your shape. The page receives what the square has decided. Dozens gone, coins received, promises noted. The figures look like small fences that will still be standing in the morning. You close the book and leave your hand resting on the cover until the stove sighs, as if to agree that the day has been reasonable. You bank the coals and listen to the iron tick toward quiet. The good tallow has set a thin skin. The mixed has thrown its dirt to the bottom and now asks for sleep. You answer yes to both without speaking. You hang your cap, fold your shawl, and let the house remember that it protects a person who makes light for a living and prefers not to discuss it. Evening keeps a respectful distance while you tidy the proofs of work. You cut the clean tallow into loaves with a warm knife, the edge sliding as if it knows where the line should run. Each block wraps in cloth, labeled with a date and a quiet intention, then stacks on the shelf like pale bricks that will build tomorrow's hours. The room smells of good fat and iron, a plain perfume that admits to nothing it cannot defend. You warm a little beeswax and draw a finger of it along the groove of your best rod. So first coats tomorrow will remember to behave. The tin comb receives a stroke with a rag and finds its teeth again. Molds are checked by a soft tap. The bright ring answers that their seams are still telling the truth. The wick box gets a small stone on its corner, so the draft at the door will not teach mischief in the night. Hunger taps you on the shoulder. Bread, cheese, and a spoon of the convent's honey agree to keep you. You eat near the stove, with the door cracked habit. Not need listening for any small lie in the settling pans. None comes. You pour hot water in a cup and hold it until your hands recall what they are for. The cup's rim shines in a way that belongs to evenings when the room forgets to be cold. A neighbor's footstep tries your latch. He carries a jar of drippings and a story about a horse that believes in standing still, only when unobserved. You trade the jar for a fair mark in your head and a pair of ends for his kitchen. He tells the story all the way to the part where the horse wins, and the man forgives it. You laugh once, because it is the correct number of times. He leaves with the air blessed by his breath and by winter. You coil a last length of wick and tie it into a dozen with a scrap of linen. A loop of twine on the wall receives it. The house looks more itself, with one more small order waiting gently for morning. You set a single 6 on the plate and light it, not for testing but for company. The flame finds its voice and keeps it. The room's corners come inward by a finger's breadth. Nothing argues. Before you bank the stove for sleep, you write 3 words on the slate above the shelf, "In Clerk School," though you have already been to all 3. It is a habit about tomorrow rather than today. A way of saying to yourself that errands will happen again and will resemble the errands you just completed. The slate pretends to be wise and keeps the words. You snuff the candle with wetted fingers and watch the small wick smoke surrender without trying to be theatrical. The dark is not absolute. It is friendly. You leave the saucer where it is and the trimmer beside it, both exactly where your hand will expect them at dawn. You lie down with the weight of rope still in your palm, and without deciding to, you dream of straight crowns and honest feet. You wake in the small hours when the stove remembers to cool, and the house confesses its small creaks. The room is blue with sleep. You rise only enough to listen. No mischief in the pans, no foolish draft through the door, no mouse practicing the trade you practice by day. Satisfied, you lay a hand on the stove's shoulder and feel the breath of embers still thinking. That is enough. You sit a while the way people used to sit when clocks had fewer opinions. But habit brings you to the table anyway. You open the tinderbox by feel, persuade a coal, and ask one kitchen 6 to be a witness. The flame arrives without argument. Its light holds to the boards and explains them to themselves. You trim it once, keeping the tongue humble. The room receives a small, accurate halo. You make a quiet inventory of what the next daylight expects. 4 dozen 6s to dip, 1 dozen stout to finish, molds to warm, 3 bands to write for the clerk's second list, and a tin of ends to sort by size, so nothing is wasted, while pretending to be useful. You set out the measuring stick, the knife, the pin, the comb, each in its true place, so your morning self will think well of you. An almanac lives on the shelf, its corners softened by thumb and steam. You open to a page that claims a change of weather 2 days hence. You accept the claim without marrying it. Notes in the margin your father's hand, your own argue gently with past winters, and agree about little more than the length of evenings. You close the book because the candle speaks more authority than ink just now. The candle sinks by a small knuckle and leaves a rim the shape of attention. You lower the wick again to the measure that never learns pride. In that mild circle you see your hands as other people will not, quick enough, careful enough, and content to repeat a task until the task seems to have been invented by your fingers. You consider this without ceremony, and let the thought leave by the same door it entered. When the room knows you are awake, the town knows it. A distant cart tests a rut and decides against it. Somewhere a door tells a hinge what to say. You return the 6 to darkness with a breath, and let the ember shoulder the rest of the night. A person who sells light is allowed to enjoy a patch of dark if it behaves. Back in the bed, the straw tick remembers you and forgives your brief absence. The house keeps its pact with the weather. The window's frost draws a new fern. Sleep returns, not like a tide, but like a hand resting on your shoulder, saying that tomorrow will look a great deal like today, and that this is not a threat. Dawn keeps you waiting just long enough to prove it still can. You wake before it and listen for the river to remember its lines. When gray finally admits to being gray, you sit up and accept your own terms again. Steady hands, quiet eyes, no heroics. The stove accepts its coal and gives back the room you prefer to live in. The kettle joins, then the candle, then the list formed in yesterday's small hours. Today we'll ask for the same patience, in a slightly different order. You warm the molds first, because frost lingers at the window and tin needs cording when mornings are blunt. You string wicks with the certainty of someone who has misplaced very little in this life and means to keep the record. The first dips follow. Thin skins learning to be less thin. Your walk between kettle and rack, tracing the same circle you traced yesterday and will trace again. A geometry that could be drawn on the floorboards. Between rounds you open the door to let the draft deliver its one useful lecture. Rods turn, paws of air stroke them cool, and the pears grow into themselves. You trim a crown that forgot humility, and murmur the measure you always murmur, as if the wick could hear. Lower than pride, higher than stinginess. It seems to help even if it does not. Toward mid-morning, the sled will ask to be loaded. The lane will ask to be read. The square will ask to be answered. You are agreeable to all three. You count the dozens that have already announced themselves, and band them while they are thinking about it. Chalk receives its truth. Twine finds its knot. Your coat waits with the patience of leather that has learned many winters. Your mittens turn inside out and back again and decide to behave. Before you go, you light a fresh 6 and set it on the saucer so the house will not forget it holds a person, and not only tools. The flame steadies as if grateful to be invited to stay. You trim once, wipe the shears, and ask the door to mind itself while you are gone. The door sighs in the affirmative language only doors speak. You lift the crate by its honest handles, set it in the sled, lay straw with a careful hand, and step into the morning that keeps making room for people who move at the speed of their work. The river keeps its counsel, the bell tests its tongue. The square will be waiting with the same small problems and the same small satisfactions. You begin again without needing a reason beyond the fact that beginning again is what keeps houses warm. Evening returns with its ordinary grace. You come home with fewer bundles and a purse that has learned weight. The door remembers you. The stove offers its shoulder. You set a single beeswax taper in the plate and light it because there should be one good thing in a room at day's end that asks little and gives much. The flame lifts, bows, steadies. You trim once. It thanks you by becoming quiet. You put away what belongs in cupboards, lay the sled to sleep, hang rope and mittens, and stand a moment without inventing thoughts. The kettle agrees to sing. Bread finds a place beside it. A spoon of honey follows. The knife rests on the folded cloth like a small, harmless question. You eat and listen to the house tell you you have done enough. You look at your hands, the small wax along a nail, the faint mark where twine insisted, the paler skin where the cold tried and failed. These are the ledger the world cannot read, and you do not need to. You write the coin and the dozens in the book anyway, because numbers enjoy being noticed. The line about promises receives a mark that means kept. A single chore remains. Bank the stove so it will remember you kindly at dawn. You do it with the same care you use to trim a crown. No fuss, no lecture, only the correct amount. You snuff the taper with wetted fingers and a brief word of thanks that does not require an answer. Darkness returns like folded cloth laid over a shoulder, warm from someone else's fire. You lie down and let the day unmake itself without waste. In the last moment before sleep, you think that all your work amounts to persuading small flames to act like good neighbors no more, no less, and that such persuasion is a decent way for a person to spend a winter. Night settles like a shawl someone remembered to mend. The room is dark by choice, not by lack. A single calm picture remains in your mind. The quiet face of the river under winter. The way the bell's note folds itself into the cold and stays there like a soft pin. You let that picture grow larger and softer until it is not a picture anymore, only a temperature. Breath deepens because there is nothing left to arrange. Every tool knows its place. The rods rest. The molds rest. The crate rests. Your hands go light in your lap, as if they have become two small, obedient animals who have been told to stay. They do. You hear the slow grammar of the house, a board answering another board, the stove giving up one last tick, the window stitching frost into a fern without asking advice. You let each sound pass through and away like water that keeps its direction without announcing it. You do not go searching for thoughts. You let them choose you only if they arrive as quietly as steam. If light were a person, it would nod at you now, pleased to have been made without fuss. You hold that knot in your mind and feel its small weight become comfort. You lie back into the straw's small geography, familiar as a map you could draw with your eyes closed. The day becomes a simple list. Wake, warm, render, dip, cool, trim, tie, carry, trade, tally, bank, sleep. Each word loosens, each word shortens. The list grows quiet. Behind your eyelids, the river widens until it is only breath. The bell becomes only heartbeat. The room becomes only a warmth that does not ask questions. You are finished arranging the world. The world will keep for the night. We hope this slow day at an old trade has been a peaceful escape. If you found it comforting, you may like, share, or leave a thoughtful note. And you can subscribe, so you'll be with us for the next quiet craft from the past. End of script. Sweet dreams.